One of the great problems with India is the relationship between the state and society. The perfect balance is when the state exists to serve society and the rights of citizens are protected. Yet, in India, as I've been saying for almost all my adult life, we behave like subjects and not citizens. We behave as if the state is there to rule us and not to serve us. We have a state that does not do what it is supposed to and meddles in our ability to solve our own problems. And with this dysfunctional state, we have entered a modern world of great complexity where you need a state that can manage this complexity. But our state is a primitive state designed to colonize its own people, and to see it struggle with this modern world is like seeing someone trying to fix a bug in a computer program with a hammer and a wrench and some nails. It can get messy. And we see this most in the growing regulatory state. The financial system is complex and dynamic and an engine of growth. Does it need regulation? Yes, some. What form should this regulation take? What are the guiding principles? If we get these wrong, everything goes to hell. And to understand what's going on with the regulatory state, we need to examine these foundational principles, we need to examine the history of regulation worldwide, and we need to peer into the belly of this beast.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Verma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Bhargavi Zaveri-Shah, a scholar and policy person who works at the intersection of law, economics, and funky out-of-the-box solutions. Bhargavi trained in law, got interested in economics, got interested in larger questions around how the state operates, became a policy person, helped draft the bankruptcy code, and design some of the new institutions that were coming up, and is doing important research and writing and work within the system, which helps form the sedimentary layers on which future knowledge and action will be built. She is also an all-round interesting person, and in this conversation we discuss the importance of ideas and idealism, her time working with government, including in the finance ministry, the history of regulation around the world, and complicated questions like the balance between independence and accountability when we talk of regulatory institutions. She also has the finest solution I have ever heard for bringing about change within our state, which comes towards the end of the episode, but I love the entire conversation. We shed so much light on a subject that may otherwise seem kinda dull and difficult, but she makes it seem anything but. Before you start listening to the conversation though, let's take a quick commercial break. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Verma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Bhargavi, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks for having me. It feels great to be here.
We've been talking about this for a long time, but you have assiduously been avoiding me, but now here you are.
Oh, I finally managed to get the confidence to be here.
Why the confidence?
The recordings, I've heard a lot of the episodes and everybody sounds so accomplished to me. So, that makes you feel like, okay, am I doing enough? You get a little bit of FOMO as well, I guess. But no, everybody's really candid and authentic. So that gave me the confidence that it's okay. I just have to, tell my story as it is. And let's see how that goes.
FOMO versus imposter syndrome is, a very interesting. And, all the women who come on the show have this whole imposter syndrome thing. And they'll be like, why are you calling me? And et cetera, et cetera. Since we're sort of on this subject, let me take...
Sorry, but on that note, since you mentioned it, and I give this example to a lot of people around me, which is that, when you're talking to accomplished people, there's a very distinct conversation that you can have with an accomplished man versus an accomplished woman. You talk to an accomplished man, say whatever, the CEO of a company, whoever you regard as accomplished, they'll normally talk about their work and how did they get where they did and what kind of trials and tribulations they had to go through. Whereas a woman will generally within a span of 3 minutes switch to where her children go to study, what are they fond of, what are their hobbies, what is their schedule like. So it just comes across that way that women generally, I feel, are a little more reticent. They don't want to talk as much about themselves. I don't know if it's nationality specific, but this is what I've observed of people around me. So, yes, you're absolutely right. Women need to talk much more about themselves.
And I've actually often been told, and I'm sure you'll agree, that, many of my really memorable episodes are with women. Try to, wonder why that is. I mean, one possible reason is that there's finally a man who's actually listening and not interrupting. But also that, yeah, it's weird to me. I've had great episodes with men, but it's really mostly with women that one can really have these genuine, authentic conversations where they just sink into themselves and they're not worried about how they sound or what point they are trying to make, and etc. etc. Do you have any theories about this?
I guess it's a little bit of the former, which is that for the first time, maybe they are asked to speak about themselves, so they come across as more candid. They haven't prepped for this. They haven't practiced having conversations about themselves, describing their lives, etc. So maybe just the authenticity of the conversation takes it up a notch a little bit. I guess women are also very comfortable with self-deprecating humor. So they'll always laugh it out, right? Oh, when I was young, I did this. I don't know how I managed to get into that program. I'm not saying men are not. I just feel like women tend to be that way, and maybe that's what makes the conversation a little more enjoyable. They can take jokes on themselves. Yeah.
Have you seen these differences in your workplaces as well? For example, Indian workplaces are famously toxic. I've had many women complain to me about how, they'll be in a meeting and they'll constantly be interrupted, and they'll come up with an idea everyone will ignore, but 10 minutes later, a guy will say it and everybody will be like, oh, good idea, Ranjan, or whatever it is, and therefore men and women just behave differently in the sense men are just themselves. Like, you can say whatever, there's no other layer of thinking or calculation that goes
Yeah.
behind that. While women are just a little bit more aware and a little reticent. Is that kind of been something you've observed as well?
So I have been very lucky to have been in workplaces where everybody's allowed to speak exactly what they want, short of foul language. You can pretty much say whatever you want. But even then, I think women are so conditioned to be self-conscious without anybody sort of imposing these rules on them. They just have molded themselves into this zone where they think twice before asking a question, making a point. Even the speed of responses in meetings, right? Like the speed of ideas in meetings, a woman will think twice or thrice. It's very famous. Most women begin their sentences with, sorry, but I just wanted to say, or sorry, am I understanding this correctly? I can assure you there's nobody else in the meeting who's understood the point better than the woman. She's actually thought it through. And so, yes, it's a good question. And if I break my life down into phases, yes, there might have been phases where I would have been in a workplace where it's harder for a woman to speak up simply because she's very self-conscious. Nobody, at least in urban settings, I haven't experienced somebody telling a woman explicitly that, just sit down right now. And but it happens in very subtle ways. I would say it happens a little bit in government circles. That's where I experienced it the most, where what you wear, I generally tend to speak a little bit loudly. So your volume, etc. matters. The assertiveness matters. And it's not looked upon in a very friendly way. People just assume that you're being aggressive because you're being assertive in a certain way, or if your volume is at a certain level, or if you're wearing certain kind of clothes. But was it so bad that it hampered me from doing my work? No, I don't think so. At some point, you also take in the social cues and you mold yourself to that atmosphere. So I would say it exists in very subtle ways, but nothing I haven't experienced it to an extent where it actually hinders my thought process or it hinders my work at all.
And I was just thinking that, you are actually in a field where I would expect less of that.
Yes.
In the knowledge economy and researchers and academics and all that. Though in government, I would expect more of it. I think one of my guests, I think Shreyana, once told me that, she works in the World Bank. So if she would, I think it was her, so forgive me if it wasn't and someone else. But basically, what this person told me was that they would go with a male subordinate to a government office and they would be speaking to the secretary or whatever the guy is, but that he would be speaking to her male colleague and not to her directly, so I guess these.
Yeah. So I had those phases where initially where they don't know you, and two equally, I would just put it this way, junior young people walking into an officer's room, and the eye contact is only made with the male colleague and not with me. And I always used to wonder, is it because of what I'm wearing, or am I too loud? Or whereas the male colleague wouldn't even give it a think. He wouldn't probably even notice that, this is something that's going on with somebody else in the room. Um, but like I said, at least I haven't faced it to an extent where you can't really, I mean, you got to absorb those social cues and mold yourself to that atmosphere. And then at least I'm the kind of a person who will just assert myself irrespective, so maybe I don't face the worst of it.
Our mutual friend Ajay once told me that one of the fundamental problems of India is that Indian men don't know how to speak to women. And I think that eye contact thing, at least, could also be coming from that they just find it too awkward to make eye contact
Yeah.
with a woman. So that, could be part of, especially if they've been to a boys' school like I had, so you just don't know how to talk to them or how to behave with them and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I don't know. I went to a girls' school as well,
Hmm.
but I feel like you grow up in a very actually in a society that you're fully surrounded by people of the opposite gender, and you haven't really figured that out. Then I don't know. I mean, it's a conditioning story. There's a systematic conditioning story going on here.
It's a very weird kind of social tragedy. I did this episode with Snigdha Poonam long ago, and she wrote this book called Young India and Young Indians Everywhere, in small towns especially. And one of the things that stood out there is that the girls have progressed in a way that the boys haven't. And the girls know how to speak to boys. The girls know what they want. The girls are, sort of have the means to sort themselves out. And the boys are just completely clueless. And I often, Nikhil Taneja made the same point in his episode with me, The Loneliness of the Indian Man, about how women have frames that explain the world to them. You can go online and you can read about feminism. Men are equal victims of patriarchy and they have no fucking clue that
No.
something is wrong. So, anyway.
And yeah, sorry, just to add to that, and men have this, I completely empathize with that, because men have to keep on this charade of confidence going on no matter what, right? A woman can afford to come across as, oh, I'm, non-confident. Why? Because every woman around her is that way. So she's very comfortable saying that, oops, I made a mistake. It's much harder for men who are generally supposed to be that way. So probably that hinders them in ways very differently from women.
Yeah, and it's a mess because for the men, the lack of humility and self-awareness would stop them from growing as people, and for the women, that lack of confidence would, stop them growing and getting to where they might have. So let me ask you a question, since you said you were sort of apprehensive about coming on this podcast. One journey among the many journeys that you made, which we'll talk about, but one sort of journey is you and many of your colleagues, etc., have made, is that you've kind of been moving from a place where you are in a world of ideas and knowledge production to also being in a place where you get those ideas out there and you enter the public discourse. And I just feel that that is supremely important. Just the other day I mentioned Ajay and said that, your number one job, your most important thing is to be part of the public discourse. You're going to at the most make a tiny difference to the Indian state, possibly zero, but the public discourse is where all of the action is. And I've strongly felt that people who are, engaged in knowledge, engaged in, being in, like if you're an intellectual, I think if you feel that your work is worth something, you also have to be a public intellectual simultaneously. That sounds very sort of grandiose and snobbish. And, I used the term for Ram Guha once and he got very embarrassed and said, I'm not a public intellectual. And I'm like, if you are not, who is? But so what is sort of your sense of that over the last few years? Because you've written a lot, you write for Business Standard, you've done lots of papers, your work comes in the lead blog, we'll link all of those from the show notes. But do you also feel a sense that it is not just about the work within that, confined ecosystem, which doesn't have public visibility, but your ideas need to go out there? Do you have that sense as well?
So I'm often caught in this, how do I put it? Dilemma. It's a very big dilemma as to how should I look at myself. That's number one, because that decides how should I divide my time. So a person like Ajay or even Susan for that matter, they've been academics at heart. They are academics. They will emphasize that it's important to work on an idea that you have and working on the idea wholeheartedly. And I think this is something that you'll be able to relate to. Requires a certain amount of detachment. It requires to be a little bit isolated, and it requires you to just kind of take out the noise, okay? And that makes you think that actually let me just work on this idea and keep working at it, because the moment I put it out in the world, a lot of noise is generated, and that will distract me from taking the idea to its natural conclusion. So I'll give you an example of this, okay? Something that I'm working on right now, which is about Indian courts are a problem, everybody knows that. However, can we predict for a litigant what his case life cycle would look like? Now, this is an idea that requires tremendous concentration and at times not telling people that you're working on it. Although, I mean, I'm just doing the exact opposite. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the dilemma is not whether you want your ideas out there in the world. You do want them out there in the world. At some level, we all are working for validation, okay? Whether we like saying it or not, but we want validation from our peers, from people who we respect, who we look up to, sometimes the users of our information. We want validation from there. So you're right, very, very important to get them out there. But at times, it's just too soon to get them out there, and then it becomes too late to get them out there. You know what I'm saying? That you keep working at it, and then you are fed up of it and you are tired, and you just abandon it. And the idea, which was in a semi-baked state, could have been out there. Somebody else could have added to it, and it could have been taken to its logical conclusion, but you didn't do it because you thought that, it's you've got to concentrate, and then it got too late. So yes, to answer your question in short, very important to get your ideas out there. In fact, if you see the mantra of any entrepreneur, okay, who's gone through the Y Combinator launch process, the first mantra is launch today. It's okay if the product is half baked. It's you learn from the feedback loop. So to get it out there is very important, but you've got to figure out the timing, because also getting the product to its deserved quality level requires a certain level of detachment and isolation, which if you get it out there, it's going to be hard to get.
I love this Abraham Lincoln quote that if I had 6 hours to cut down a tree, I would spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. And the key point there is that at the end of that 4 hours, you have to cut the tree, right? I think. So just thinking aloud, like I've stolen a frame from economists to apply to the creative process, and I'll invert that slightly here. And the frame is of stock and flow, right? And in the context of a creator, recently I've been thinking that we are engaged in both producing a flow and producing a stock. And like a regular blog or a newsletter or a weekly podcast is like a flow. You're constantly putting yourself out there, and often it's a two-way thing, and it's great. And then there is a stock, and a stock is like a book. You work 5 years, you do a book. You work another 5 years, and maybe you work 1 year, or if you're Pranay Kotasana, you work 2 weeks and you have a book, right? So, and that's a stock. And what I've been telling creators is that, listen, the stock is important. I see you doing the flow, but I don't see you doing the stock. But with you, I'd invert that and say that what you're then doing is you're doing the stock. You're doing the papers, you're doing whatever, but that kind of constant flow where you're engaging, I wonder how that works. Like I'm reminded of a former guest of mine, Alice Evans, who so it was interesting. I was in Delhi and I was recording with Alice Evans, and I'd also invited Ashwini Deshpande. And at one point I realized that there was a Twitter battle going on and they were at opposite ends of it. And I soon realized it was down to a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding was this, that Alice used her Twitter for two things. One was talking about her work, which was rigorous and just fantastic and done really well. And the other was thinking aloud. And people would often confuse the thinking aloud for work and say, hey, what is a rigor? You call yourself this, you call yourself that. Where is the data? Where she's probably just been to a wedding and she's seen something and she's musing aloud. And that conflation kind of happened. And I was in that awkward thing of recording with both of them. And I think Ashwini ji would now perhaps agree with me that she was a bit harsh on poor Alice, and Alice was just interacting in good faith. But I thought that even if that conflation happened between thinking aloud and whatever, I think that is exactly the right way to do it. Like, I love what Alice does all the time, or philosophers like Agnes Callard use Twitter for that, where they're constantly out there and they're engaging and they're throwing their ideas and people are throwing ideas back. And of course, it is harder today than it was 10 years ago because Twitter has become so incredibly toxic. But regardless of that, you can find a space where you sort of do that. So, how do you feel about this tussle, between sort of doing the work and also being a little more open in the world of ideas?
So here I would, really use the frame of what is the journey of an idea? What is the journey of a good, profound idea? As you know, Karl Marx wasn't really popular when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. I mean, by then maybe a little bit more popular than what he was before. But that is an idea that actually posthumously has affected a significant portions of humanity much more than ideas that might have been popular at that time. So I would say that this is my experience, and from my reading I can say that the journey of ideas is that it normally starts in an academic environment where you don't have to deal with this noise, where there's no urgency to get that idea out and to convince people about it, etc. The work that you do in those formative stages of, is extremely important. In fact, sometimes it is so hard that you spend most of your life doing that work and then you didn't have enough time to put it out. So I feel in society, there are people who work on the formative stages of the idea in isolation, in a detached way. And then by the time, they're way past their prime, somebody else picks it up, maybe builds up a little bit on it, and then puts it out. So I feel that ideas, we really underestimate the amount of thought that really goes into an idea. And maybe one life cycle is not enough to develop an idea fully and to communicate it to the masses and to convince them that the idea is right and to convince your detractors as well. So if you think about it, it's a little bit like division of labor, where the idea is actually born in a university setting in amongst the people who are actually interested in the idea for its own sake. They need not be interested in it because, it will affect the world. And maybe you think that's not a great way to be, but actually maybe you need somebody as detached to work on that idea in an impassioned manner, that if it fails, he is invested enough to say, okay, this is not a good idea. And, it's too late to go back on my position because I've taken it publicly. So I would say that you got to divide the journey of an idea from its formation stages. Maybe social media has now made it possible to do both parallelly, but I feel the people who pick up the idea are people like you, people like journalists, people who either pick up the idea, add to it, and then put it out there. So it's okay to let that cycle be spread across many people. I don't think that, it should be that one person who's the originator of the idea should be able to communicate it. It's perfectly okay if it's spread across many people. It also depends on your propensity to be both. Not everybody has the capacity or the interest to actually communicate it and be a mass communicator. I'll sit in British Library and write the Communist Manifesto. And, somebody else will pick it up and run with it. Somebody known as Vladimir Lenin will pick it up and run with it and implement it and then say, oops. It's so be it.
I mean, there are 100 communist manifestos nobody picked up, and that's the but, and in a couple of sentences you also gave Darwin's biography, because this is exactly what he did. He sat with a foundational idea for like 20-30 years, and then suddenly he's told that there's this guy called Wallace and he's got the same idea and he's going to publish, and then Darwin goes out there and says no.
Yeah. So I think there's a very famous saying that actually a lot of science, a lot of inventions in science are due to professional rivalry more than you being passionate about the idea, you're just so insecure that somebody else will pick up the idea and run with it. I better finish my work and get it out there. So that's exactly the story, right, of Darwin and Wallace as well.
That's a classic economist insight, incentives, rivalry, what better sort of incentive. And, Keynes once said that, quote, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist, stop quote. And we see that all around us. And here's sort of the other thing that I totally buy your point that not everyone plays the same role within the ecosystem. There are some people who are popularizers. There are some people who do the dirty hard work, and people do what their interests drive them to, what their personality drives them to. But at the same time, I think there is sort of a point of conflict where, on the one hand, and I see this with many of my friends, that on the one hand, you can tell yourself that I'm playing the long game, that nothing's going to happen in the short term. It's a 30-year process, 20-year process. I play my part. My dharma is to do my bit. It's a long game. I don't change anything. But that runs up against the fact that you might feel that there is an urgency to your ideas, that you feel strongly you have to express it now. For example, and we will talk about this in much more detail later, but you've written about Aadhaar, for example. There's not enough accountability built into that, right? Now, the popular narrative of Aadhaar is, the anti-narratives will be about privacy, the pro-narratives will be about how good the tech is and all of that. And I've had people argue for both of those on my show, and both of those have a point. But the hidden sort of narrative which you talk about is, what are the regulatory mechanisms? What is this agency? Who does it represent? Who is it accountable to? How do you keep it accountable? What are the mechanisms we built in place? What are the governance structures? Nobody is giving a shit about any of this now. It's going to bite us in the ass in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. This whole digital public infrastructure thing is as well. And therefore, it is natural to feel that, hey, this should be part of the freaking discourse. They are arguing about all those irrelevant things which don't matter so much as this matters in a democracy. So then, how does one sort of kind of balance that out? That some things are of urgent importance, and on the whole, you're playing the long game. There is that long arc. But
so I'll tell you what, on that Aadhaar argument, right? We were actually just riffing off an idea that has been there for a very long time, which is trust the process. You build in the right processes with the right incentives for the various stakeholders, and, all your concerns about privacy and authentication failures and people being excluded will be taken care of through the process, right? But even to get to the evolutionary cycle where humans are able to say, actually, the process matters more than the output or the outcome, it must have taken at least a century for people to say that, we trust the process. I mean, that is the story, frankly, of American constitutionalism, which is that if we put in the right process and we build in the right institutions, hopefully things will then, no one person or no one bad intentioned actor can actually skew anything towards anybody's favor. So I would say that we are actually drawing upon theory when we talk about Aadhaar and accountability frameworks that has existed for a very long time. It's not something that is very original to us. We are actually taking inspiration from other jurisdictions and what has worked elsewhere. But truly original ideas, in my opinion, take much more time and require much more of an isolation. And I'm not only talking about academic research ideas. Even when you talk to an entrepreneur who's working on a new product, which is not simply, I'm going to copy that platform and, which is a different product, he or she requires a certain level of isolation to be able to even test out that product with 5 people to see what kind of responses he's getting. So I think we totally undermine the amount of, let me just put it as detachment required for you to be able to make a really good product. And then you just bank on whatever it is, luck, destiny, whatever you want to call it. If the product is good enough, it will figure itself out and will reach the masses at some point. So if I were to divide the amount of attention that one has to give to creation of an idea versus dissemination, I would put it at somewhere between 80-20. And if you can't do the 20%, it's perfectly okay, because you know what? You spend those 4 hours chopping the axe, somebody else will cut the tree.
I'm really glad you said it's okay if you don't do the 20%, because when people ask me, what do you do to market seen unseen? And I'm like, a good product is the best marketing. So that's kind of like my dharma is to just have the best conversations I can and put them out. Baki is, whatever happens, happens. So here's a question, when you were talking about the fundamental question about Aadhaar that resolves everything is about, just focus on the process and all of that. And in India, that's never been the discourse. In India, it's all tribal warfare on both sides. And that leads me to thinking, and it's a thought I had even earlier while I was going through your notes and reading some of your pieces, that is it the case that we have a primitive way of thinking about the state? The whole idea of American constitutionalism emerges from the fact that the Constitution is there to set the rules of the game, to control the state, to protect the people from the state. The people are, what really matters. The state is there to serve them, and the Constitution is that bag of rules, meta rules, which, enables that to happen. And here, by default, we've got into an opposite mindset where the mindset of continuing the colonial state. Only instead of brown rulers, we've got white rulers. The state is there to rule us. It's a my bab thing. And therefore, it is not so much institutions, but people who become the focus of our attention on the state. And even more so, that at a deeper level, I would imagine that at some fundamental level, and tell me if you agree or disagree, that within India, when you are the state and you're setting up a regulatory institution, whether it is a SEBI or an RBI or whatever, you're setting up some kind of agency that will do some kind of regulation, your mindset is not that this will help the state function better and serve the people better, and so you build in accountability, and so you build in all of those safeguards. Your mindset is that this will help me govern better, rule better, and therefore those safeguards and accountability take a backseat because it is not part of your mindset only. It is not that you are inefficient at designing a state properly. It is that you don't even consider this a necessary part of the design.
Okay. No, this is a very interesting question. Why do we set up these regulatory agencies? Why did we have to set up a UIDAI? And maybe not so much in the context of UIDAI, who I necessarily see as a social security administration agency more than a regulator, but a SEBI, etc., right? So the origins of this is extremely interesting, okay? And most people take it back to the New Deal, and there were scandals and people couldn't trust the private sector anymore, and therefore we needed more agencies. Actually, the origins of this goes back to the 19th century. So, okay, place yourself in 19th century America, okay? Late 19th century America. The technique of oil drilling has just been discovered. Steam engines have been around for a very long time. The Civil War has just ended, and you are seeing new cities are springing up, and cities are figuring out how to connect us to each other. Okay, so new railroads coming up, and all of these are private railroads. And what happens is that you're somewhere around 1887, and railroads, which are private entities, then start distinguishing between the senders of packages, and they start arbitrarily fixing different tariffs for different kinds of senders of packages. And that's where the state, and when I say state, I mean their state level government, steps in, saying that, listen, if you're a carrier of packages, you can't do this arbitrary pricing business, and I'm just going to make sure that you're fair to everybody. Okay, that is I would say, the classical role of the state, which is to ensure equal access, right? And that somehow fails because the United States, being United States, it challenges it to the courts, and the courts say that you cannot intervene on private property. Railroads are private companies and you should allow them to do what they want. And then what happens is they set up this agency known as ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Okay, the Interstate Commerce Commission is supposed to be regulating railroads that run across states. And the reason I'm trying to tell you this, to answer your question, is because you're right that we brought in regulators before the markets had even taken off. On the other hand, where it originated, the markets had already taken off, and then regulators came in because people saw that there were some arbitrary, unfair practices. And the idea of regulation was to make sure that the private sector is playing this game in a fair way. The idea is not to, sort of regulate the hell out of railroads, for example. It was just, I will make sure that you're charging everybody in a fair manner, okay? We've taken it the other way around, where we've said in 90s, when our regulators were set up, okay, we said that we don't have a private sector right now. We want a private sector, but first let's just have our regulators in place, So before even the first company could actually access the capital markets in a free pricing regime, we had our securities market regulator set up. We don't even have a market. We don't even know what kind of arbitrary practices are we likely to see in this kind of a market. And maybe that has governed the mindset of evolution of regulators in India. And every time we see a market, oh, we want a regulator. So, for example, right now we have the data protection law coming up. The data protection laws presumably just sets out principles on which people can, share data and use other people's data. Before the law, the law, we don't know whether it will be enforced, etc. They want a regulator for it. So what I'm trying to say is that whilst regulators originally came up as a solution to identified problems with the market, in India's case, as in the case of most countries that actually came up with regulators in the 90s, before the markets came up, we had our regulators. So their job was to basically regulate. You see, once you're in existence, you'll find some job for yourself, and you'll tend to over-regulate if you already exist before the time the market comes up. But to go back to the America story, because that's a very interesting history of how regulators came up. The the Interstate Commerce Commission that I'm talking about, that regulated railroads at that time, it was not supposed to be independent of the government. Okay, so today regulators are believed to be independent. They're supposed to be independent because there is a belief that they will regulate the market in the interest of not their political masters, but in the interest of the market. It's so interesting that the origins is actually not that the regulator was independent. He was actually an agency of the executive, but one of the lawyers of a railroads company was elected the American president. Okay. And then people said, but listen, you are the interstate regulator of railroads, and one of the railroads owners has become lawyers has become the president. You have to make sure there's no conflict of interest, and therefore please make sure that the regulator is not reporting to the ex-lawyer of one of the railroads companies. And that's how the first ever independent regulator sort of came to being. But it was just to make sure that there's no arbitrary pricing on railroads. That's the whole thing. And whereas in India, we've come to a different mindset where we believe that the moment there's a new industry, there's got to be a new regulator.
Yeah, that's a classic engineering mindset of the state, and also the tendency of the state to just keep expanding wherever it sort of sees an opportunity. So a couple of questions to just double click on that. That's a fascinating story about how the happenstance of the president being a lawyer of a railroad company leads to this whole independence thing. But conceptually, how should we think about an independent regulator? Because on one hand, if you go back to the meta question of why is a state legitimate, where does it take its legitimacy from? And then we know how it arises, how it evolves, but where does it get its legitimacy from? And the simple American answer to that at the start of the republic was it gets it from the people, right? But if your independent agency is going to be like independent of the state, then who is it accountable to? Why is that legitimate? How do you sort of keep track of what's going on there? So just conceptually, without looking at independence there or independence here, like people here will say that, the RBI should be independent of the government, or the election commission should be independent of the government. And at one level, the argument is for that is, yes, obviously, because you don't want politics to, you want our institutions to be safeguarded from the politics of the day. And that's really the great victory of America. Why, despite January 6, one Trump, or you put the worst person in the world you think of as president of the USA, which some would argue we've done twice, you simply can't do too much damage, right? Because the institutions are so strong, and the institutions are so strong because you have those safeguards built in, and they're independent. But where is the balance between independence and accountability? Somebody could even buy the election commission. Some rich businessman could just buy the election commission and, sway the whole thing. Hypothetically, independence is not a guarantee of anything. Accountability is a guarantee. So how does one think about this?
So I'll tell you what, all the reasons that I can offer for why there should be independent regulators is ex post reasoning. Okay. So there's a very famous quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a judge of the US Supreme Court, that the life of the law is not explained by logic, but by experience. Okay. So there is I think we've got to take the historical view here to understand why they exist. So, the mechanical answer to your question would be regulators should be independent because we want these industries to be regulated not as per electoral cycles, but as in the interest of the consumers of this industry. Okay, that's the mechanical answer. That's the independence question. We want regulators to be independent. Why? Because it's easier to change rules and regulations than change parliamentary law. Okay, they'll tell you we want regulators to be, independent because we actually want experts to be regulating these industries. But how do you explain all of this when you divide regulation between regulators who are not accountable to the people, are unelected, and between a government? By that logic, everything should be outsourced to an unelected expert body, right? So these reasons are all, I would say, retrofitted into making sense of why regulatory agencies such as SEBI, IRDAI, FSSAI exist. But the truth is that the history of it is actually, a lot of it is just historical accident. Okay, so the one example that I gave you was the FCC, right? Where it just so happened that one of the railroads lawyers became the president of the United States, and the carriers who were really the senders of the packages were really businesses. They got together and they told FCC that you can't be reporting to an ex railroad company's lawyer. Okay, so that's how the first independent regulator came into being. And if you actually then go on to how this whole thing developed in the early 20th century, okay, we're talking before World War I, there was a lot of corruption in American government. And I'm sorry I keep referring back to American history because unlike colonialism or unlike the history of the Constitution, a lot of regulatory agencies, their history can be traced back to the United States and not the European continent or UK. So again, beginning of 20th century, pre-World War I, cities are being built, railroads, highways are being built because suddenly, it turns out that oil is actually not so expensive. So moderable highways are being built. And there is a lot of corruption going on in government contracts, and people have generally lost their faith in government. They believe that, but at the same time, they believe that government alone can answer these problems. Only if we elected the right people, actually, these problems wouldn't exist. Now, just think, all your theories of public choice, the rationalist thinking that we now apply to political science is really a product of the 40s and the 50s, mostly 50s onwards. The first time the word public choice was used was in the 1950s. So we are still in the beginning of the 20th century when people thought government is the answer to corruption. Okay, more government. So they said only if we get the right people elected, somehow we'll be able to do this. So low trust in government, but still government remains the answer. And that's how you see one or two more independent agencies who are not full of corrupt people who will be put in charge. And people said this is a good idea. These guys are experts. They are not answerable to our corrupt government and they will solve our problem. Okay. And then World War I happens and nothing much is going on. And then the 20s, okay, which was really the roaring 20s that they speak of in the American sense, was actually a movement of great progressive reform where government was also expanded to a great deal because as people move to cities and as they start demanding more of their government, as Max Weber says, as you demand more of the government, bureaucracy is going to increase. So in 20s, again, you see a few more new regulators and it's the post-war normalcy period, all is good. And then comes the Great Depression of the 1930s, where there are a couple of stock market scandals in 1931-32, and you have your Securities Exchange Commission and a whole bunch of new regulatory agencies being set up. And there they are just mechanically applying what did we do when people did not trust the government. We actually set up an interstate Commerce Commission, which regulated railroads in a very impartial manner. The experience was mixed, but we don't know any better. Let's just set up these independent agencies who will report to nobody. It's okay if they are full of experts. Right now, trust in government is low. So let's just do this right now. And that's how you get this full regulatory agency movement going on in the United States, where you see a proliferation. Naya industry dikha, set up a regulator. Okay. So they all believe this would prevent concentration of powers in the president, essentially. And then, I would say 1946 was some sort of a pivotal year, because the United States realized that actually we've set up all these regulators. They're all independent from the government, and therefore there's no way the elected people can actually send their feedback loops. We've got to do what we do best. We'll trust the process. And they enacted a law known as the Administrative Procedures Act, which required these regulators to put every regulation through a cost and benefit analysis, take public feedback, and so on and so forth. A lot of administrative lawyers believe that 1946 was the equivalent of, in politics, you have this paper, no, End of History.
Yeah.
Francis Fukuyama, End of History and something of the man or something like that.
It was the paper was End of History question mark. People miss a question mark at the end, and by end he didn't mean end as in terms of finish, but the means and end wala end. So a very misunderstood
Oh.
paper. Yeah. So one should. I'll link it from the show notes. Listeners can read it for themselves.
I always thought it was the paper which summarized the end of the ideological battle between communism and capitalism.
No, it was end as in the means and end wala end, and there was a question mark at the end of the paper, but when the book came out, there was no question mark.
Okay.
But the meaning of the end was still the same. So people sort of criticize Fukuyama as if, he got it wrong, but he wasn't saying what people think he was saying. But anyway, just separate point.
Yeah, separate point. So 1946, people thought, okay, we've figured this out. Okay, we've set up these expert agencies and we've set up a process under the Administrative Procedures Act. And the expert agency is not political. We'll make sure the expert agency testifies before our Senate committee hearings. That's how we'll get their accountability going. Even at this stage, independence was not so important. Okay. And what started happening is, if you just now we are in that trajectory, we are sitting in the 60s and 70s, okay, where every single agency in UK and the United States was focused on just basically rebuilding war-torn economies. Okay, the United States was doing it for France and the rest of Europe, and UK was doing it for itself. And at that time, there was no independence as such. Every agency is supposed to work with the politically elected executive to mobilize resources, to rebuild economies, and independence did not matter. Okay. So, heydays of Keynesianism, where
Keynesianism.
I don't know how.
Bugger should have had a simpler name.
Yeah, Keynes should have a simpler name. Okay, so even central banks supposed to be so independent, right? We take it for granted that central banks are supposed to be politically independent. They were used for national development projects. Their deficits were monetized all the time, right up to the 60s. And then we enter stagflation, where actually there were significant advancements in research which showed that the trade-off between inflation and growth is real. And the Phillips curve doesn't hold for a very long time and things like that. And then you have your Milton Friedmans, etc., coming up with papers like, should we have an independent central bank, with a question mark? Okay. So this connects me to that old point of why the origin of the idea is actually sometimes you just got to work at it in a detached way, because by the time the world needs it, at least it's ready enough to be pushed out in the world and be put to some real use, right? So we're standing in the 70s, all these research is coming up which shows that governments shouldn't be automatically monetizing their deficits using central banks. If they do that, inflation is a real possibility. And if inflation exceeds certain threshold, growth and employment suffers anyway, okay? So in the 80s and 90s, we started having a lot of research papers that measured the independence of the central bank. Okay. And IMF and World Bank took it upon themselves they bought this framework and they said that central banks have to be independent if you want to keep inflation within tolerable limits in different countries. Now, that is the whole sort of history of the idea of independence of regulators. Once central banks it was conclusively established that an independent central bank is able to manage monetary stability better than a non-independent central bank, that idea was mechanically applied to every single field of regulation. And therefore, all other regulators who came after that, independent regulation became like a mantra. Without really applying your mind, do you really need independent regulation? Do you need regulation by the unelected, by independent regulators for something like, I don't know, agriculture? Do you need it for insurance? It doesn't seem obvious to me that you need an independent body to be regulating who gets an insurance license. I mean, the vulnerabilities of that are as high as, the government licensing, I don't know, telecom broadcasters, for example. So I think independence is sort of a force-fitted explanation for something which is for an idea that has actually been influenced by a long arc of history. The other thing that was going on in the 1990s was this whole, institutional economics literature that was coming out by the droves, right? Which is the idea that actually some countries are successful more because of the institutions that they build, and therefore independent regulation became a mantra that was replicated in every country that was either separating from the Soviet Union, once the Soviet Union broke up, so particularly in East Europe. And then India still didn't have this, by the way, the independent regulation thing going on for itself, because when we got independence, the only agency that we had outside of the government was the Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India was not into banking regulation at that time. It was just in the business of managing the exchange reserves. And then I can talk about the development in India, but to answer your question about the balance between independence and accountability, I just want to make the point that it is not obvious that for every new market that comes into being and that needs regulation, you need an independent regulator. You can very well have the central government regulate it. You've then got to build processes to make sure that the regulation happens in an impartial manner. This whole business of setting up regulators by the droves, we should be a little bit warier than what we are, because there is a charade of independence when none is needed, and it's not like it actually exists. And second is we trust the experts way too much then.
Fabulous sort of potted narrative that you just sort of gave. 3 or 4 things I'll double click on before I sort of come to the next big question. One is you sort of mentioned the growth of the regulatory state in the 30s as a response to the crash of 29. And I recently read Thomas Sowell on that period, where Sowell wrote, and I'll quote Sowell now, as for the 1929 stock market crash, unemployment never reached double digits in any of the 12 months following that event. Unemployment peaked at 9% 2 months after the stock market crash and began drifting generally downward until it reached 6.3% in June 1930. That was when the federal government made its first intervention in the economy with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. After that intervention, the downward movement in unemployment rates reversed and shot up far beyond the level it had reached in the wake of the stock market crash, and so on and so forth. He goes on with the narrative about all the, and what states seem to do, what I think the American government did then, and what states generally seem to do, is trying to manage a world that is deeply complex. They come up with simple answers that seem to intuitively make sense, but often, make no sense at all. Amity Schlaes also, by the way, has a great period about the 30s and the 40s are linked to that from the show notes. And, and the easy answers are the most satisfying. And obviously, when the world is spinning out of control or when you don't really know what's happening, the easiest answer is you set up another government body, you set up, another sort of independent agency which will do whatever it has to be done. Secondly, just to sort of demystify what you said about the independence of the central bank, and you can tell me if I'm sort of summarizing it for the listeners correctly, is the reason it is so important is that the money supply in the economy is essentially controlled by the central bank, by the interest rate that it sets. If the central bank is controlled by a government, the temptation for any government, especially if you're facing elections, is you lower the interest rates, you pump money out there, so there is a sense of exuberance. In the short term, the economy seems to be doing well, and that is a natural temptation because you have the next election to win. But the result of that, of course, if the money supply goes up, is inflation. And inflation, as we know, thanks to people like Milton Friedman and his early, lonely, pioneering work, inflation is a tax on the poor. In the long run, that's really who it affects. So the whole very sound basis for the independence of the central bank is that you keep it away from political considerations. And it would seem that friends of ours like A.P. Krishnan and Ajay Shah also pushed inflation targeting in India, which finally happened in 2015. And that seems like a fantastic mechanism that you can sort of keep it independent, but you give it a target that keeps it accountable. Ki boss, this is your target. You have to achieve this target. You figure out how to do it. Iske upar niche nahi. And then it really doesn't matter what the level of independence is, because the mandate is sort of set out there, and that is the the core incentive in play. Now, speaking of incentives, you mentioned public choice theory again. For those of my listeners who is rather an unlikely event if regular listeners haven't heard this phrase from me, but public choice theory is basically, it looks at people in government as individuals responding to incentives. So you don't look at the government as this benevolent beast which will do all these beautiful things you want it to do, but they are individuals responding to incentives. You have to see what those incentives are. Ajay and I had an episode of Everything is Everything on it. We'll link that from the show notes. Now, and there also one of the core incentives is that the state always tends to expand. Parkinson's law states that every bureaucrat will want to maximize his own budgets and have as many people as they can have under them. So those are where the natural incentives go. Now, in the light of this, where a lot of the thinking around this seems to be reflexive, it is reacting to something that, oh shit, inflation is out of whack, it hurts growth, it's a tax on the poor, what do we do? Independence for, that particular agency. So a lot of the thinking on this, we seem to be leading to these axioms, but tend to be sort of reflexive and are not really coming in a first principles kind of way on what a perfect design is. So give me a sense on how the thinking has evolved over the decades on this, both in the world and in India, about what this balance should be, this balance of independence and accountability. Like, if any, and I'm thinking aloud here, but when I look at a regulatory agency, what are the factors which could make me say that this should be independent? And what are the factors which would make me say that, no, it doesn't need to be independent, it can be part of the state? If it is part of the state, what are the safeguards we built in? If it is independent, how do we keep it accountable? So how has the thinking on that really evolved over the decades as such?
Right. So, okay. So 2, 3 things. Okay. One is okay. First is I think one is to say that, yes, the government has to be, in the face of a crisis, the government has to be seen to be doing something. Okay. And you said that you're absolutely right. They just take the most simple notion of how do we get better, and we say, okay, we'll actually make this politically insulated. The truth is, very few regulatory decisions can be truly devoid of political considerations, but that's a separate matter. So there's a very interesting anecdote, example given by Dr. Subbarao in his latest book, where he says that, look, if you even apply public choice, right? A goalkeeper, okay, in a football field, there's a 26% chance that the goalkeeper will actually that the striker will actually strike straight. Okay, in a football field, the striker will actually strike straight. There's a 26% chance, but there's only an 8% chance that a goalkeeper will not move. When a striker strikes straight, the goalkeeper's got to be in his place. He's not supposed to move. But despite these numbers being known, despite the goalkeeper knowing that the striker has a near 1/4 of a chance that he will strike straight, and I needn't do anything but stand here, the striker actually stands this way only 8% of the times, because at an individual level, at a human level, we always want to be seen as doing something. The striker wants to be seen as having moved his leg or a hand towards the right or the left, and I think that scales to an organizational level. An organization wants to respond in the face of a crisis, and if it means that people get confidence that a regulation is being made not by elected people, at that point in time, then so be it, although it may have adverse long-run consequences, right? So once these agencies were in place, there was no going back. They will find reasons for themselves to exist. Once you are employed in an organization, you will find a reason for yourself, either because it gives you meaning for your work, or you genuinely believe that I am better placed to protect the world than the elected officials are. Whatever it is, they are in place. And the United States answer to this was the Administrative Procedures Act. They said, we'll trust the process. So what do? They say that, look, when you put any regulatory agency actually performs 3 kinds of functions, right? Which under our constitution is supposed to be done by 3 separate wings of the state. So the parliament makes a law, a regulatory agency makes regulation that binds everybody. The executive So our government licenses establishments, it does investigations. The regulatory agency itself licenses firms, it does investigations, conducts inspections, audits, etc. And courts are supposed to be doing the punishment and enforcing of the law. In the agency's case, the agency itself does this. So there is a big problem here, which you can easily see, which is that all the powers which were supposed to be separated in a separation of powers function are now fused in one agency. So the kind of checks and balances that you need to have on that agency are much more than what you would normally sort of want to put in place when three different bodies are doing this work at the level of the government, right? So what the Administrative Procedures Act and other countries which have regulators do is that when the agency performs its regulation making power, which is the equivalent of parliamentary law, it's supposed to put the regulation through a cost benefit analysis. It's supposed to actually draw feedback. It's supposed to explain why they didn't take into account some feedback and not others. And here there is a real danger of capture, right? So if you're talking about, say, for example, a banking regulator or an insurance regulator, my predisposition towards listening to a depositor versus a banker who I'm actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis, I have a certain congenial sort of attitude towards him, the chances that I'll actually listen to a banker and trust his expertise is much more me as the regulator than a depositor who I would believe that actually, it's a small guy, not a big problem. So that is why the process will actually take care of these kind of things. That, for example, if a banking regulator says that no bank should make loan against gold deposits, okay, a lot of households would be quite upset with that in India, I suspect. A lot of households in India own a lot of gold, and the ability to get credit against that gold is a fantastic way to monetize that asset. And I suspect a lot of households would be upset if the banking regulator would come up tomorrow and say that banks shouldn't be lending against golds and NBFCs shouldn't be lending against gold, or making it more expensive to lend against gold, right? On the other hand, the banks would come and say that, whatever you say, our license actually depends on you. So me as a regulator, I'm much more likely to be captured by the industry than by households whose interests are actually going to be disserved by this kind of a measure. So you put your regulation, if you are going to come up with a prohibition on lending against gold, you put it out for cost benefit analysis, you get feedback, you publish the feedback so that people know what have you taken into account when you were actually making this regulation, okay? At the level of executive, which is when you're licensing banks or when you're licensing insurance companies, you're licensing mutual funds, there you have basic transparent licensing processes so that people know on what considerations licenses are granted and not granted. It's not like banks in India where you get a license once every 20 years, one random license is given to something. You don't want that scenario playing out for the sake of your own legitimacy. Also, the other thing is investigations, right? Who are you choosing to investigate versus not? I mean, we all know that every time a law is violated, it is not necessary that enforcement follows. Enforcement is rather selective. It is often discretionary, and rightly so, because the regulator has to optimize his resources and cannot go behind every possible violation. So what are the considerations influencing those investigations? What are the considerations influencing the penalties? An open hearing, a show cause notice being given to the person who will be penalized. All of this seems pretty basic, in my opinion, hygiene for anybody who's exercising these kind of powers. And this is exactly how regulatory agencies who are unelected and, full of experts, this is how they build legitimacy for themselves, by being transparent, by putting out, when you're punishing a person, following as close a process as a court would follow when they are punishing a person, having open hearings and so on and so forth. The second level of this is all that you will build inside the organization. The second level of checks and balances is oversight institutions. Since these regulators are supposed to be independent, okay, many of them are in fact counter-majoritarian. A central bank is essentially counter-majoritarian, right? You cannot expect them to report to the central government about their activities, their financial audits, even their performance audits, but they're supposed to be accountable to the people, and therefore you make them accountable to the elected representatives. So it is very common. For example, 4 times a year, the chairperson of the Federal Reserve goes and testifies before the Senate on why certain interest rates were cut, were not cut, what is his anticipation over the next 6 months, what does he expect inflation to see. If the inflation game doesn't play out the way he thought, in the next hearing he'll have to explain what went wrong. Okay, so inflation targeting, yes, is one part of how you build checks and balances, but that's like a pilot. You got to do that for every other function. And now you may say, but are parliamentarians even interested? And we can come to the effectiveness of oversight institutions separately. And the third is courts. Okay, a lot of these are quasi-judicial decisions, especially when regulators punish people. Like, think of the recent Paytm story, right? Paytm's bank license was cancelled with a press release that was not more than half a page long. We don't know what went wrong. Okay, so the usual process for doing this is that if a regulator passes a quasi-judicial order, there should be an appellate tribunal which people should be able to approach. In the UK, on the other hand, regulators don't have quasi-judicial powers. So a regulator will do the investigation, will prepare the investigation report, and will submit it to a court that, basis my investigation, I believe this person is guilty of having violated my regulation. And then the court will decide what is to be done, whether the person is actually guilty and whether he should be punished. And this seems fair to me, that I shouldn't be the judge of my own cause. I shouldn't be the writer of the law, the enforcer of the law, the punisher of the law. That just doesn't make sense to me. The police cannot be the prosecutor, prosecutor in turn cannot be the judge. It is just basic hygiene, which a lot of countries have managed to put in place because I believe regulatory agencies are now inevitable. As much as I may say that they were an accident of history, they are inevitable. People somehow value the experts anyway. So, but then you basically trust the process and you put in a good enough process that is trustworthy.
And has that kind of happened in the West? Like, can we look at best practices from elsewhere and say that, okay, the US has sorted this or EU has sorted this and et cetera, et cetera? And is there a danger of overreach there? Because on one hand, you can and you should say who will watch the Watchmen. But on the other hand, who will watch whoever is watching the Watchmen as well, which can, I think come into play when you talk about oversight agencies or, so certain best practices, yeah, like in your pieces, which of course are linked from the show notes, you've spoken about ex ante accountability mechanisms like independent directors, regular internal audits, performance-oriented goals, etc., etc. You also laid out ex post accountability mechanisms like, having to report to Parliament, allocating resources towards the next year, reports, performance audits, etc., etc. But is there a is it a settled question about what exactly these processes should be, or is it something that there is always a constant tussle about? And we'll come to India after this, of course, which is in a much more primitive stage as far as all of this is concerned.
So it seems that, yes, Western countries, and when I say Western, I include Australia, because it is, it's actually done pretty well on this front of building in enough processes to make sure that that we are not all subjected to the tyranny of the unelected, right? These processes seem very, they're very much there in the United States. You can doubt that on and off they do not function. Sure, that's possible. But they exist. Okay, so the example that I gave you of the UK, let's take the case of their financial regulator. Suppose a mutual fund, okay, is found guilty of having missold certain schemes to old people. Okay, so it's your classic ULIP story, which is that actually a financial investment which is supposed to be meant for young people is missold to old people. And it's pretty risky. So not the it's obvious that it's not a perfect product for a retiree who actually needs an annuity kind of an income. And this mis-selling is happening at some scale. So what does a financial regulator do? They have something known as a consumer facing authority, and the consumer authority will do the investigation, will write out the report, but will not have the powers to punish that mutual fund. It will actually apply to the court. And the court will look at the report. There will be arguments from both sides, and then the court will decide what is to be done. So you'll find that these processes actually exist in a pretty established way in some of the more mature markets. And I'm not saying anything that's rather radical. It just exists.
You've pointed out how agencies can often regulatory agencies have can exercise three kinds of powers: quasi legislative, quasi executive, quasi judicial, and there's no separation. Such there are some, especially in India, which will kind of do all three. Take me through sort of the Indian story of what's been happening here. Like you've spoken about, you've written in the past about how, the different concerns about these agencies include, number one, weaker links between the people and agencies, which of course is the case here. Number two, unfettered discretion. And your illustration for that was SEBI and RBI never being challenged in all the things that they have done. In 30 years, no order issued by RBI has been challenged by the person penalized, which sounds incredible to me, which basically means it's so difficult to do, and that mechanism isn't there. And you've also spoken about the ever-growing footprint in administration of public affairs, and you've pointed out that the annual expenditure of the RBI is larger than states such as Goa. So if any Goans are listening to this should outrage you. What the hell is going on? Yeah, RBI con hai. Do they have beaches? What is this?
Right. Okay. So India is a story that actually begins in the 80s. I mean, as in every other aspect of India, I feel some of the best stories of India actually begin with liberalization. Okay. So we did, like I mentioned, we did not have regulators prior to 1990. Okay. We had just had the Reserve Bank of India. Of course, in the 1940s, the Reserve Bank of India was given the power to regulate banks. But that power was also to be jointly exercised by the central government. What you see through the years is that the government, although it believes in setting up regulatory agencies, it is not willing to cede its full sovereignty and make it fully independent. Okay, so in the 1940s, if you see a lot of the parliamentary debates, there was a clear predisposition towards making Indian banking a nationalized industry. Okay, so you will see that there are parliamentarians who are saying that, look, this was in 1948 when, as you can imagine, the country had just gotten independent and there were parliamentarians sitting and they were debating whether who should be regulating our banks. Okay. The obvious answer was, of course, the government, our new government will also regulate banks. But who has experience dealing with banks? And they said, actually, the Reserve Bank of India has experience in dealing with banks. But Reserve Bank of India said, and there's a very interesting, conversation amongst the board members of Reserve Bank of India, that our new government will be capable enough and will regulate banks in a much better way than the British have been, abusing our capital. And our government will actually nationalize all the banks so that the money of the banks can be used to serve the farmers and the small businessmen of India who have always been wronged by these banks, and these banks have always preferred British businessmen and things like that. Okay, so those debates are absolutely incredible. The point is that at that point in time, there was no clarity. The clarity that we have today of independent regulators and what purpose they serve, that didn't exist at that time. And therefore, you have a hodgepodge of regulatory powers for banks between RBI and the government. But that's about that. That's what we knew. In the 1970s, when banks were nationalized, RBI's powers as a regulator were also increased, but the whole idea of independence was not yet there, I mean, even in the world, like we had just discussed, 70s was the time when it was independence of central banks was just kind of bubbling up in the discourse. So people did not have that clarity. By 90s, people had the clarity that there's some value in keeping independent regulators. And then, the whole deregulation movement that started in India in late 80s onwards, two things were going on. One is, if you want to deregulate things like the capital markets, you've got to give a certain assurance to the companies that will be raising capital that you will be able to raise capital for whatever purpose you want at whatever price you believe will get you the best subscriptions, and the government will not suddenly suspend your IPO or suspend your company. At about the same time, we had the Harshad Mehta scam. So it just made sense. I mean, I guess it was just optimal to separate out regulation from the government of India into a separate body known as the Securities and Exchange Board of India. And that gave us our first regulator. Okay. The first casualty of the liberalization movement as such is this body known as the Controller of Capital Issues. Okay, the Controller of Capital Issues was within the government of India. It used to decide who can raise capital in India, for what purpose, at what price. Because all this while, the idea was that we should be using household savings for national priorities. Okay, so there's total capital market capture of the by the government of India, and therefore the first casualty of the liberalization movement is really this controller of capital issues. Now, SEBI was set up as a body that would regulate the capital markets in the interests of investors as well as firms raising capital. But at the same time, the government was not used to the idea of independence of regulators. So it was even with the RBI, if you remember, the idea was that we are regulating banks jointly. With SEBI, therefore, if you see the SEBI law, there is a provision which says that central government may give directions to SEBI in public interest. Now, that's a classic way to undermine true independence. Okay, so once we had SEBI, we had the SEBI experiment going for about 4-5 years. And then, just like how the idea of central bank independence scaled to all other regulators, the same ideas, how do you, SEBI was kind of, it became the cookie cutter solution, so to speak, of every segment of the economy that you want to liberalize. Somehow it gave people more confidence that there is a separate regulator, so we should be better. Keep in mind that it's also easier to capture a regulator as compared to the government. Okay, so if you are an industry, it's much easier for me to build long-standing relationships with a regulator because there is some continuity of bureaucrats there. Unlike the IAS officers who get transferred from ministry to ministry and departments to departments, within a regulator, since experts are being recruited outside of the civil services system, they are within the organization for a very long time, and therefore it's much easier to build long-standing relationships, and capture becomes easier. So it's not, the industry was very happy with having these regulators because they could, build long-standing relationships. I don't know what consumers felt, to be honest. So for example, am I more comfortable as a consumer of banking if RBI regulates banks versus Government of India? It's a tough one. I don't know. Maybe I am, because I've had this experience of nationalization of banks. But if you talk about am I more comfortable as a trader in the stock exchange when SEBI regulates versus government regulates? I don't know. So I don't know how consumers felt about this. Maybe it gave them more confidence. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. But then, from the 2000s onwards, after SEBI experiment had worked for a little bit, they started setting up the other regulators, such as the insurance regulator, the telecom regulator, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. So think of a sector and you probably have a regulator for it in India by 2005 or so. Having said that, 3 caveats. One, the government was not fully confident of setting them up truly independently, and therefore you have these anomalies in the law, in each of these laws, saying government may give directions from time to time. Second, the whole package of accountability was also not correspondingly imported. Okay, so this whole idea of regulators having to do cost benefit analysis, putting it through feedback loops, etc., wasn't there. Oversight institutions, okay, these regulators are supposed to lay down their reports before the parliament on an annual basis. But to what extent our oversight institutions have capacity to actually take interest, review them, question, it's open to discussion. I'm not sure parliamentarians really pay as much attention to anything that is tabled before them, except when there's a scam. So in times of scams, you do see parliamentarians actually questioning the regulators as to how things blew up. But otherwise, you see, I think Dr. K.P. Krishnan and a couple of his co-authors have a paper on how often do parliamentarians review or raise questions on annual reports of regulatory agencies, and they find that the response rates are abysmal. I mean, so these are the 3 sort of problems with which our regulators are functioning in India today. And the 4th problem is that we are not able to replace them as people because they are not elected.
I'm going to talk about cricket now, not because I'm bored with finance, but I'll tell you why I'm talking about cricket. So in the early 2000s, I worked for this British company called Wisden. They famously bring out the Wisden Almanac and etc. etc. And at one point, we bought Cricinfo. And later on, of course, we sold Cricinfo to ESPN. Wisden exited. Wisden later came back as Wisden. Forget all that. So I was in this company called Wisden, and we buy Cricinfo, and I'm the managing editor of Cricinfo. And then obviously we we want to make the site much better, etc., which is a long process that we embark upon. And we realize an interesting technical problem, that the way Cricinfo was built is initially it was a spectacular open source, almost Unix-like collaboration with various people coming together and building the site in different ways. But by the time we bought it circa 2003, it was just a complete mess in terms of all the legacy software and all the legacy issues. And my thing was that if we could just build it from scratch, it would be great, but we didn't have the time or resources to do that. So everything was jugaad. You're adding features you want in your new content management system on top of the old content management system, and there are all kinds of jugaads and all kinds of things going wrong, and that messy process continues. And the more you invest in that messy process, the harder it becomes to actually make a sort of a clean start and start from scratch. And I think anyone who's been in a big software company, etc., must know what that is like. And it feels like what happened to the Indian state is a little bit like that. That, at first glance, I may not like the idea of SEBI as a regulator. On second glance, you tell me about, the CCI as it were, which was controlling, who can go to the public market with an IPO and who can't. And just the thinking behind that is so regressive. It is just so profoundly stupid that you all have to, do a collective thank you to a God who does not exist, that, that was a casualty of liberalization. And then you look at SEBI compared to that and you say, wow, this is beautiful. It's such a step forward. It's so liberating, right? And then the years have to pass for you to take a further step back and say that, no, actually SEBI as it is a deeply suboptimal solution. All these things kind of are wrong with it and are a problem and all of that. And by the way, you mentioned the term capture a few times, so I should clarify for the listener that what you mean is not that people from a company will go inside a regulator's office and hold them at gunpoint. Regulatory capture basically is that you take over the working of a regulator either through bribery or other subtle incentives and so on and so forth. And the idea there is what in public choice theory would be called diffuse cost concentrated benefits. That for the consumer at large, they don't even know what benefit they have from a good regulator. So they are not going to go out and fight for that. But for the companies within that field, they know that it's big bucks if regulators make regulations that might, harm the consumer by keeping out competition or whatever the case might be. So that's where regulatory capture comes from. But my question is, when I think of this sort of metaphor of a sort of legacy software system where everything is all over the place and therefore all you can do is make little incremental changes and do jugaru things. And in that sense, SEBI is like a jugaru thing. It is a creature of the moment and it is mind-blowing and fantastic and a step for freedom because you've got rid of the CCI. But devoid of that context, if you look at it for what it is, you can find 500 things wrong with it. So my larger sort of meta question before we dive into the weeds about SEBI or India's regulatory agencies is that my worry there is that a couple of forces take over here. One is a force of inertia, that the state has to do something and it's like that yes minister line, we must do something, this is something, let's do it. One, the state has to do something, but then it does that and then inertia takes over until the next crisis. There's no need to change anything. There is a status quo bias and things kind of drift along like that. And the second part is that, weak state capacity, and I'm thinking aloud here, can lead to a vicious cycle where it leads to more weak state capacity. So for example, if you've made a SEBI and you're saying, okay, now let us build the processes and frameworks like the West has so it's accountable and all of that. But who's going to do that? You don't have the state capacity to do that. So therefore, your state capacity in the form of SEBI or whatever agencies you have remains weak. And the vicious cycle and inertia come together and the same kind of shit just perpetuates through the years and through the decades, which is why it is a long game. So what is your sense of this? Does this metaphor kind of work? Is that really what is happening?
Yeah, in a sense, you're right. Okay. So this is where I would bring in the experts element of this. We believe that experts are in charge. They know what they're doing. Okay. So we make no effort at improving what exists. And that is exactly what is happening at the level of the oversight institutions. Parliament believes that actually SEBI is in charge. SEBI knows what it is doing. So Parliament is very happy to expand SEBI's powers, even if it actually, they're most vulnerable to misuse, even if there is no way to figure out if they are being used in the right and in the most proportionate manner. That is the Parliament's reaction to inertia, which is that SEBI hai na, to kar lega. So basically very comfortable. And I use SEBI as an example. This is true of every regulatory agency, that the, the veneer of experts gives a certain legitimacy which makes you very comfortable. Okay, so that is at the level of the oversight institution that the inertia really manifests itself. Similarly, at the level of the courts, okay, the inertia manifests itself. Courts rarely ever intervene with regulations that are made by regulators. Okay, so already there is a presumption of constitutionality. What do I mean by that? If Parliament passes a law saying everybody has to wear blue ties to work from tomorrow onwards, if it is challenged, when it is challenged, the court presumes a certain constitutionality, and it is for the challenger to show how that provision violates a fundamental right. Okay, so already whenever a regulation or a law is made, there is a presumption of constitutionality. So to override that it's the onus is on the challenger. Second is you couple this with experts, but experts have made this. Okay, so can you imagine how hard a barrier it is for anybody who wants to challenge any regulation made by an expert body to prove before the court that this actually makes no sense? So the inertia sort of manifests itself in ways where the oversight institutions just go by what the regulator is doing, and the regulator has no incentive then to improve. Okay, now I'll give you some. Now of late the trend has changed. Okay, so the classic doctrine here is again from the US, and we've imported it blindly, is the Chevron doctrine, which is that if a regulation or a rule is made by an expert body, the courts will generally be deferential and say they know what they're doing. The purpose of their existence is this, so why should we get into it? Okay, and Indian courts do that rampantly all the time. So things like I don't know, it's too technical, so forget about it, but what I'm trying to say is that uh, the inertia manifests itself through these oversight institutions. The regulator has no incentive to then improvise, and all feedback loops are essentially drowned out. So you say that, SEBI actually makes us feel that we are liberated from the from the control of capital issues, and that's true. But then if you think that actually since the last 2-3 years, something like a commodity derivatives in key commodities have been banned and that ban has been existing for the last 3 years, it makes you wonder, are we even better off? I mean, maybe, and I'm a Hegelian at these things where I believe that the course of history takes its natural course anyway, and one particular event wouldn't have changed the course of history. Maybe the school of thought of having capital issues being controlled by the government would have evolved anyway with the control of capital issues, where its powers would have been diluted to a point where it aligns with the prevalent economic ideology, and just setting up of a new institution actually made no difference. It would have actually anyway lent itself to more freedom for raising capital by and more freedom in trading of financial instruments. So I don't know. So I'm just, the inertia definitely manifests itself in oversight institutions. I don't know how else to measure it, to be honest.
So let's take a quick commercial break now, and on the other side, we'll finally get to your biography. I know nothing about you. Who are you? What is your name? We'll talk about that after the break. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've enjoyed teaching 27 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, and an online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST, or about $150. If you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just a willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Welcome back to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm still chatting with Bhargavi Zaveri, who, as you know, plays the long game. So this podcast is very much a long game. So let's talk about your life a bit. So tell me about, where were you born? Where did you grow up? What was your childhood like?
Okay. So this is a tough segment, huh? Okay, got it.
This is the easiest segment. You know this. You can't go wrong.
Yeah. No, so I'm actually a Bombay person. I'm born and brought up in Bombay. I grew up in a very classic Gujarati suburb of Ghatkopar, which is known for its which is more Gujarati than Gujarat itself, at times. And you'll have the best Navratri dandiyas and the best Guju snacks, etc., being served on the roads there. And yeah, that's that. It's an interesting place.
What did your parents do?
My dad was an engineer. My mom was a homemaker. And the rest of my family was, of course, as my surname suggests, in the jewelry business. But so my dad was a bit of a black sheep as a professional, black sheep of the family.
So as you were growing up, and I'm guessing this is 80s, 90s?
Yes, 90s.
90s. So what was that sort of childhood like? Because, being perhaps half a generation older than you, I think of myself as being on what is really a cusp generation, where you grow up in a world that's a closed world and there are very few options open to you, and the world is close to you. There's no internet. You don't really know what to do. You have limited ideas. Are you going to be doctor or engineer or IAS? And I chose the one thing that was outside of that, as it happens, at the time. And then suddenly everything is open, and the possibilities just increase. You're no longer confined by communities of circumstance. You can form communities of choice. Your way of looking at the world opens up. So what was it sort of like for you? Like, what was the world for you as you grew up, and what was your perspective of yourself, your self-image, as it were?
Yeah. No, actually, my trajectory was very similar to yours, but maybe in a different context, because I would just thinking about it now, right? I would divide my life into two parts. One is where I was the conventional, I actually I was very conformist. So I was a Jain temple weekly visitor. I was surrounded by generally, kids of brokers or business people. And so my thinking was also very much influenced by uh, the usual conventional early 90s, late 80s, whatever you can imagine that Indian society, Bombay urban society to be, that was the milieu in which I grew up. And even after college, I went to school actually in a convent school, which was honestly it was quite radical for my family. And had my mom not fought for it, I would have never been in a convent school. I would have been going to a Gujarati medium school, which is also fine. I see a lot of my friends from Gujarati medium schools, and they grew up fine and they're doing very well wherever they are, to the extent that they're working right now. And but I guess that might have been the most profound decision, that most important decision that affected my life in profound ways. I wouldn't be half the person that I was if I wasn't in the school that I was in. So luck, you can call it luck. I just lucked out there.
See, the Hegelian view doesn't work for individual lives.
Okay, I can equally argue that, you know what, the school didn't matter. I would have turned out this way anyway. No, I completely agree. Maybe at an individual level, it doesn't work out the way Hegel claimed it did. So unlike a lot of your guests, I've lived my entire teenage life, young adult life in one city, pretty much in one suburb. And I went to government law college, which is also a very conventional decision for somebody in Bombay who wants to do law. Okay. And you're faced by the usual pressures of, oh, don't you want to become an engineer? I was a decent student. Don't you want to take up science? Why would you do law? At that time in the early 2000s, taking law was not a very prestigious career option. People didn't quite know about the fact that law firms pay so much, or that the law, their perception of a lawyer was somebody sitting outside a court under an umbrella charging $100 to notarize an affidavit. Okay, that is the perception of a lawyer, of the average lawyer standing in the early 2000s. So GLC, Government Law College in Churchgate, was my first exposure to a very, very different heterogeneous group of people, because GLC has a 50% reservation for notified classes from Maharashtra. So that was really my class was extremely heterogeneous. So you could be coming to college as a child of a judge or the most high profile senior IAS officer or IPS officer, or you could be from, you know, a suburb like mine, where I have no background in law. So you could be and from an income class like mine, or you could be from the reserved section as well. And that was my first exposure to a very, very heterogeneous group of people. Um, but that was really a time when I was extremely conformist, I would say. In hindsight, all of this is very good in hindsight. I wanted to be the lawyer that you see in Suits, the cool guy the cool girl who wears high heels and wants to do all the corporate, financial, regulatory, negotiation stuff. And I ended up joining a law firm when I was in my third year of law school, because l- like a lot of law schools in India, GLC doesn't offer much. Okay, you got to learn on the job. And that's why most people start working by the time they're in their third year. And I ended up giving an exam known as a solicitor's exam, which is supposed to be a harder exam than the average law exam. Very few people pass, and it's meant to train you in commercial law, property law, tax law, uh, pretty much in line with my idea of a lawyer from Suits. And uh yeah, that was that's my early life.
So, knowing you the little that I do today, I think of you as someone who is an independent thinker, who's got great clarity, who's got positions that are thought through and articulated well, and etc. etc. But obviously, it's something that you arrive at over time. So I'm very interested in the shaping of yourself as you were. Like, you spoke about your path as being a fairly conventional conformist path. You wanted to be in Suits, law sounded like fun, etc. etc. But give me a sense of, what were the things you cared about passionately and deeply and thought about? Like, one of the subjects I thought we could chat about either now or later is your deep commitment to vegetarianism. Now, that is, vegetarianism per se is something that you would have just have inherited as part of the family, but it's also something that you have thought about deeply, and you have your own ethical frameworks and your arguments and etc. etc. And that's something. So what were the things that you were thinking about? Were you deeply committed to certain things? Like, when I look back on myself as a young person, I think in 80 to 90% of things I was just drifting through life, just doing whatever is a norm, not really thinking about anything or thinking through anything, kind of like sort of being almost a zombie. So what was it like for you? Tell me about the shaping of yourself.
Yeah, so I mean, what I just narrated was the part of life where I was just surrounded by conformists and therefore tended to be part of the mainstream conventional thinking. What really, I think, changed everything was I moved to Boston after working for a couple of years over here, because I joined my husband in Boston. And I was very clear I didn't want to do the classic master's program and then kind of join the workforce there. By that time, to be honest, I was bored of the law firm work. Okay. So everybody who goes into law following Suits ends up getting bored. So please don't go into law thinking that Suits is going to be a real life. It won't. So I mean, on a more serious note, I was bored because the thing with a law firm life is that you end up doing the same thing over and over again. Monotony gets to you. And at some point, you feel like, I'm not going to learn anything new over here. So the timing just turned out to be right. And at that time, I got a research fellowship at the Harvard Law School, where I had proposed to them that I'm going to be studying the interface between lawyers and the state. That how do lawyers really advocate for their position, not before courts but before the executive, because it is very clear that lawyers have, given the extent of involvement of the state in the day-to-day life of businesses, it is very clear that lawyers actually have to deal with the state outside of the courts as well, right? So how do lawyers interface with the state? What kind of lawyers get the ear of the bureaucrat? How does a bureaucrat view the lawyer? Does a bureaucrat view the lawyer as necessarily a partisan person, or does he view it as a feedback loop, and so on and so forth, right? So at Harvard and in Boston, I think it's such a special place. And a lot of people go to the Harvard Law School and think that they're going to get great education. I think the education part is overrated. There are two things really nice about the institution are your peers. So what you learn from people around you is just incredible. And second is um, just the rate of failure. So Boston is such a special place because you have the MITs and the Harvards there, and pretty much everybody is working on an idea that has either not been tried before, or maybe it's been tried but in some other format, and the rate of failure of people failing around you is just so high that it's almost a chip up your shoulder to say, hey, I started something and it didn't work out and I'm just doing something else. So the positivity and the let's just say the spirit to do something that not everybody is doing is just so entrenched in that city that it fires up your imagination. It inspires you that even you should try and do something unconventional if you haven't already tried. And it's okay if you fail. What's the worst, right? By that time you've figured yourself out enough to understand that what, I'll just go back to a law firm job if things don't work out. Although I've got to say that I have two recurring dreams. One is of getting arrested, and second is going back to a law firm job. So you can imagine how at what level I place those experiences.
If you get arrested, you'll be fine because you know lawyers. You are one.
Oh yeah, that's true. You never know. So anyway, so Boston basically gave me the courage and to say that it's okay. I can try something that I'm not familiar with. Step out of my comfort zone, and I'll be fine. And incidentally, at that time, I read a book by, it's not a great book. I just read it at the right stage of my life. Accidental Prime Minister by Sanjay Baru. And, the workings of government, etc., really got me interested. And at that time, the macro finance group at NIPFP led by Ajay and Ila Patnaik were recruiting lawyers or people who, they wanted to build an interdisciplinary team. They already had economists and statisticians. They wanted a person of a different skill set. And I just happened to be interviewing Ajay at that time. And he said that I'm looking for lawyers. And I said, okay, cool. I think I'll be interested in joining and trying this out. And for me, it was a big step to step out of Bombay, to step out of that little suburb and life of mine, to move to Delhi. And the perception of Delhi is that it's not safe for girls. So, the backlash that I got from a conservative household, it was something, but fortunately, it all turned out to be fine. Spent 2 years in Delhi working at NIPFP with the Ministry of Finance. Interacted with the government so closely for the first time. And I've got to say that I was really lucky because I feel like I interacted with the best in the government, working with the Department of Economic Affairs on questions like how should we regulate mutual funds? How should we regulate commodity derivatives? How should we regulate foreign exchange? All of that. And working along with the economists, it just widened my perspective to a great extent. Sharp learning curve, but it was an experience that completely changed the way I think about life and what I want to do with my life. So that's what really shaped my thinking at that time.
So, bunch of things I want to double click on. And the first is this, that I think, Bob Dylan once said, he not busy being born is busy dying. And at some point you were busy being born, but whenever people are busy being born, it's really, I think of it in two ways, and I'm completely thinking aloud and winging it. But there are two possible ways in which you can do it, or there are two possible ways in which you can be filled with life and meaning. And one is where you like a quest, you are embarked upon something, you like the processes, whether they are processes of intellectual inquiry or diving deep into something or whatever, and you're invigorated by that, and that gives meaning in and of itself. And the other is that you have some higher purpose, that you say that I'm playing a 30-year game, that maybe every incremental tiny difference I make to the state can impact millions of people, and oh my God, that is so inspiring. And then that purpose sort of drives you and kind of gives your life meaning. So what is, and my sense is that when you that it is more of the first that you mentioned, that you were at Boston, that you felt invigorated at new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things. So I want you to double click on that, but also what is the balance between that and this greater sense of purpose? Like, over the years as you worked at NIPFP and beyond, was there also a greater sense of purpose that I'm part of this project and I might be a tiny cog and my contributions may be invisible at large, but it's important.
So I think for different people, it plays out in different ways, although I think both things happen for most people. Okay. For me, it played out with starting with intellectual curiosity. I was curious that, so whilst I was very, very familiar with financial regulation laws, I know that the loop wasn't complete. In my head, I just couldn't understand, why does the state regulate this but not that, and what does the RBI really do? So all those questions the law itself cannot answer. And for that, you need a different disciplinary perspective. And so for me, what drove me in the beginning was intellectual curiosity. I was not motivated by some high purpose of, making a difference to people's lives, etc. But one, as and how that intellectual curiosity starts getting satisfied, you start looking for meaning in other things. And maybe what then gives you meaning is this sense that you are actually making a difference. So for me, the way it played out, and, my time at NIPFP was all about learning, following this intellectual curiosity and answering these questions. But by the time I finished my learning at NIPFP, I realized that now I think I have a sense of what drives policy and what drives the decisions to regulate something versus not. What does the history of ideas look like? I think by then I was looking for meaning in through contribution to real life. And that's when I moved to Bombay, when again, luckily enough, there was a team led by Susan Thomas at IGIDR. It was called the Finance Research Group, mostly statisticians and economists. She was looking for lawyers because they were actively involved in the drafting of the insolvency and bankruptcy code. And for me, that just made too much sense to just join that team and build up their legal capacity. And that's how I ended up being part of such a community, even in Bombay. Although I've got to say that in Bombay, to find such a community is not easy. Such communities thrive in cities like Delhi, which has always been a center of intellectual learning. Bombay is much more transactional when it comes to these things, much more business and trader oriented. Now you'll see some of it in Bangalore, in cities like Bangalore and Pune, but moving to Bombay and then being part of a team that continues to do this kind of work was just, call it a stroke of luck, call it something that I was anyway, sort of being driven towards. So by the time I moved to Bombay, it was about, okay, now let me see how I can contribute to this. The learning was largely over, and it would, of course, keep happening throughout the years, but by then it was something else. So I feel both the phenomena that you mentioned play out in the course of a person's life. Some things drive you at some phase in life. Maybe that the drivers change in some other phase.
Yeah, you said everybody goes through some combination of both, which is like total selection bias, because everybody doesn't. Most people don't have either in their lives, and
yeah, I meant that everybody who follows one ends up following the other,
yeah,
or vice versa.
Yeah. Tell me about the roles that law and economics, studying law and economics particularly, and economics obviously not formally in that sense, but by osmosis, the roles that they played. Like, firstly, in the context of law, I'm interested in whether it taught you to think in a particular way, a systematic way, taught you to dive deep into things, taught you to absorb knowledge, and etc., etc. Like, how does the causation really work? Like, I guess it's a virtuous cycle, but do you already have to be inclined to think in those ways to get the most out of studying law, or does studying law just naturally make you a better and more rigorous sort of thinker in that sense? And I'll come to economics later, but just in terms of...
Yeah, so I think law teaches you to think in a very rules-based framework. But I wouldn't say that it equips you with a lot of critical thinking skills, at least not the way the way law is taught in India. Okay, so some of the things that I notice are things like basic concepts of limited liability, basic concepts of, the difference between constitution versus rule, the difference between constitutional challenge versus an appeal before a tribunal. All of this now seem like they seem obvious to me. I don't think they would have been so obvious had I not gone through the law training. The difference between an executive body and a judicial body, the difference between a judgment of a court and a law made by parliament. Uh, all those things just wouldn't be so obvious but for that training. So in a way, what law teaches you to do is think through structures of decision making, structures of, yeah, I would say decision making primarily, but also structures of organizing things. So it's a very rule based understanding of things, but it doesn't give you the opportunity to question much on how those rules came to be that way, because there's no time either left in your training, and then you are at work and you stop questioning naturally. But economics, on the other hand, I'm sorry to jump to that.
No, please.
Economics gives you a much more first principles understanding of why is the law structured in this way, and does it make sense? Does it align with human behavior? Does it shape human behavior at all? So economics for me completed the cycle of understanding of why the law is the way it is. And of late, I've become a big follower of legal history, and I feel like now legal history is supplementing that understanding, that even if something doesn't make sense, how did it survive the test of time? And then you realize, actually, if you look at history, a lot of it is just accident, and there's no great thought process that is being given. A lot of it is just people reacting. So I that, like you were telling me, that I find myself really lucky that I'm able to now form a complete understanding of the questions that I'm interested in. If I see a phenomenon, I have some sort of a framework to apply. Okay, let's see what the rules are. Why did the rules become this way? If it doesn't make economic sense, maybe there was an accident of history that led it to be this way. So I think completeness of understanding is what law and economics gives you in ways that either field in isolation can't.
I love economics as a study of human behavior. I think it applies to absolutely everything. And what I find kind of fascinating about your journey and want to dig into next is that, in a sense, you were learning economics and you were learning about the Indian state and regulation almost simultaneously. If you had learned about economics earlier, you get all the theory and you get the principles and all that. If you get exposed to the state first, you might explain all the shit that is happening in different folksy ways. But you're learning economics that gives you the frame, and then there's a perfect application of that frame on what you see in your everyday life, not just in terms of the markets whose regulation you're helping with, but also in terms of the state itself, what it looks like from inside, how people behave, etc., etc. So tell me about this process of being in the belly of that beast, like literally in the Ministry of Finance, working with NIPFP, with Ajay Neela. And take me through that sort of...
Yeah. So completely agree with you, right? I mean, you almost make it sound like a lab where I'm being exposed to different things to complete my understanding, as if this thing has been designed to complete my understanding of things. But absolutely, very well put. NIPFP, early days were a culture shock, okay? Because I was used to working in Bombay, which culturally is a much more open, frank city. You can pretty much at the workplace speak your mind, and you can be frank and you can be honest and you can call out things and you'll be fine, at least in the workplaces that I worked at. But Delhi was a different ball game, because once you work in the government, I don't know if it's a Delhi thing or if it's a government thing. Maybe it's a mix of both. I realized that, as I was saying in the beginning, there are some attributes which are just not appreciated at the workplace. Okay, so being frank, being candid, etc., wasn't an attitude that was appreciated much in the North Block, I've got to say. You learn that over time. It took me almost 6 months to realize the mistakes that I was making. Maybe it wasn't that I was a woman and that's why the joint secretary or whoever wasn't talking to me or giving me eye contact. Maybe it was just the way I was putting across things that wasn't being appreciated. So culture shock, absolute culture shock in the beginning. Part of the culture shock was also linked to the fact that, there's another discipline of economics, which is actually probably a little more important to understand than law. And learning that from peers, that was also a sharp learning curve. Some of the lessons were very harshly taught to me. Another culture shock was the fact that you work in the North Block. And I have to narrate this incident to you, where for about 2-3 months we were sitting in North Block, okay? And North Block looks very grand and everything, but it's not a most efficiently designed from a work organization perspective. So there's I don't know if you've been inside, but there's a courtyard in the middle, and I'm sure even South Block looks like that. There's a courtyard in the middle, and then there are galleries, and offices are organized around those galleries. Okay, so you're going in round and round, and then there are no directions. Okay, and the way you would identify a senior officer's office is if there are a lot of peons sitting outside, you would figure that that's a senior officer's office, and you would make your way around that way. I realized that look, the bathrooms here aren't clean. Okay, then I was just not used to that kind of stuff. I realized that food delivery doesn't happen over here. Nobody wants to come to North Block and deliver things because they'll have to go through a hell lot of security. Okay, so one day I went back to NIPFP in the evening and I complained. I stormed into Ajay's cabin and I told him, listen, this is not what I signed up for. Okay. And at that time, I was very new. So in hindsight, I mean, I've got to give it to my guts, but whatever. So I went to Ajay and I went on a rant about how, it's not done that we are being made to sit there. The bathrooms are not clean and the food doesn't come on time. Nobody listens to me. I did all that. And he heard me out. And after about a 7 or 8 minute rant, he said, point taken. But do you realize that any other person of your age would probably give their right hand to be where you are right now? That really sort of put things in so much more perspective. So that was just an example of how my early days at an IPFP were. And but on the work front, seeing one thing that really surprised me is that the law student is made to believe that a law was drafted this way and it was passed by Parliament. Every law is actually a negotiated outcome of many interests, okay? And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. There are so many interests at play here. There's so many biases at play here. And you see that negotiation happening when you're sitting in government and you're working with government officers, and it's just beautiful. It just opens up your mind to just a whole new world of how laws are made. And at the same time, you see that, all the things that we complain about once the law is made, it's not like people don't think about them. So, for example, when check bouncing was made a criminal offense, it's not like people didn't realize that, listen, but we don't have prosecution capacity or courts are overburdened. It's a little bit of like what you said in the beginning, which is that the government must look like it's doing something, right? So, all of it playing out in real time in front of your eyes and you having a ringside view of things was just great. This, especially in the context of inflation targeting, I was just very lucky to be there when the law governing inflation targeting was being drafted. You are getting to see an institutional reform that has been worked upon for over maybe 12 years, 15 years. And you just happen to be there at the time when it comes to fruition. How lucky you got to be, to be placed that way. And then you got to see the negotiation between the RBI and the Government of India, the discussions between the Government of India officers before those negotiations happen. What are the considerations that weighed for each parties? And then you end up going back home and reading all the literature that exists, explaining their positions. A lot of this is about being at the right place at the right time, opening your mind enough, not having so much FOMO that, but if I was in a law firm, maybe I would be doing much better. You've got to let go of that. You've got to detach yourself from that, because policy and research will not pay you commensurately as a law firm job or an investment banking job would pay you. I think it requires a little bit of unlearning of a lot of things that you've already learned, but you get to see the process, play out in front of you, and that's just beautiful.
Was there sometimes a sense that that counterfactual seemed more attractive to you sometimes? Like, for example, your Guju Ghatkopar family must have said ki are law firm mein karti, itna kamati, etc., etc. Or perhaps you see your colleagues in the law firm suddenly doing well and going on fancy holidays and blah, blah, blah. And, was there ever a sort of a sense of that? Maybe like you refer to one time when it was difficult, when you went and stormed off to Ajay and, khana nahi milta, toilets are bad, and etc., etc. And And so were there times like that? And what would you tell yourself to convince yourself this is worth doing? Like, what was a story about yourself that you told yourself?
No, luckily, this never happened to me. So once I moved to the policy and research space, I've never had the FOMO of wanting to go back to a law firm. Like I said, in fact, it's a recurring nightmare that I have to go back to a law firm. So, but I know that. I mean, one is that I was lucky that I didn't have to think so much about supporting a family. I just had to support myself and had to pay my rent and my bills, and that's it. But if I had to support a family, yes, it would be a tough one. But to be honest, once you see this lab around yourself where theory is actually playing out in reality but in ways different from what you imagine, and where you're talking to people who know the law that you're talking about but are telling you why the law is this way, it's just very hard to unsee it and to say that, okay, I'll go back to that law firm job where I'm interpreting an is or the or shall or may, and trying to convince an RBI official about why approval should be given for some $100,000 that are to be remitted into India. I mean, it's very hard to unsee what else can happen with your life if you choose to give up that.
Paint me a picture of the engine room of government. So you were in the Ministry of Finance. Now people will have stereotypical views of how government works, what the belly of the beast looks like. You've got all your classic yes minister, yes PM sort of impressions, and the mental image is immediately of a babu surrounded with lots of files, and chai and samosas break takes 2 hours, and etc. etc. All these caricatures exist, but you were actually in the belly of the beast. And like, one question I often have, a question that I've asked Ajay, and I'm not sure I can agree with his answer. Like, both Ajay and KP Krishnan, I've asked them the question that, were you guys outliers? Because it seemed to me that the way the system is designed, if you just follow public choice theory to its natural conclusions, you will have a sclerotic state which will not move, which will be a lumbering beast where your incentives aren't aligned with public service, etc., etc. And therefore, all the outstanding civil servants, some of who have been on the show, like Krishnan and Montek and so on, seem to me to be outliers. But they insist that no, there is hope, they are not outliers. So what was your sense working there? You mentioned earlier that you met some outstanding people there, Department of Economic Affairs and all of that. So is it the case that, yeah, sure, there are the standard public choice incentives, but there are also other incentives which drive human beings, which is there's an incentive to do good things, to leave a legacy, to rise in your own self-esteem by feeling that you made a difference. Was that also in place? So paint me a picture of that engine room. What was it like? What did your typical day look like? What are the kind of things that you do? What are the kind of discussions that were had? Give me a picture.
Yeah, so here I think my take would be slightly different from Ajay and Dr. KP Krishnan, because I happen to have interacted with a lot of young IAS, IRS officers as well. And I see a very remarkable distinction between the young guys and the older fellows, right? So, first of all, bias on the table, which is that when it comes to the older cadre, I've only dealt with the Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, which has arguably some of the best IAS officers over there. Amongst the older cadre, I mean, every person is different, but by and large, I did see a certain drive to make a difference. You may not agree with the view of the officer on how the difference is to be made, but I wouldn't say that they were not motivated or they were undriven and they were actually just coming to office and just doing their job. I've seen some extraordinarily hardworking officers who stay back after work, who actually put in a lot of thought before signing a file, and are not just driven by ye bureaucracy karni hai, So amongst the older officers, that is my observation, but it's very different amongst the younger people. I think they know that they have to rise in this system. So if you look at the conversations that you have with them, I find that they are driven much more by the next posting. How do I get a year off at, I don't know, IMF or OECD, or they get a year or two off for conducting higher studies, etc. So the conversations and discussions are pretty much about getting those benefits that your recruitment offers you, as opposed to the larger worldview of, why am I here? Why am I an IAS officer? Why am I an IRS officer? So maybe when you're young, your prime consideration, you're driven much more by those questions of how do I rise in the ranks, as opposed to when you're old, when considerations of legacy become important to you. That when I retire, I want people to say this. I want to be known as an officer who did this. So I see that difference. Having said that, every officer is, I mean, at least the ones who I met in DEA were very different from each other. Some were, I would always classify on the spectrum of socialism to capitalism. So, where do they stand on that spectrum? Because it would tell me something about their willingness to intervene, their willingness to keep their hands off, and their approach towards a specific question. And there, I would say that you would find it's a wide spectrum. You would find everybody on pretty much every point of that spectrum. But it's worrying that the younger ones don't even think about that spectrum. And most of the younger ones I meet are, I happen to, so my PhD is at the National University of Singapore at the School of Law. And we share a campus with the Lee Kuan Yew School, where a lot of IRS and IAS officers come for their mid-career education programs. And talking to them gives me a sense that they somehow do not have the worldview, are not even interested in forming a worldview at all. Either they've been conditioned to think apolitically, okay, or maybe it's just a function of age, and as you grow older, those considerations of legacy, etc., become important. Yeah.
I'll come back to the engine room question later again, but a larger question and something that I think about is that where does idealism or where does purpose come from? Like my dad was an IAS officer circa, I think, 64, 65 batch, something like that. And what he once lamented in his last years was that in his days, in his batch, they were driven by idealism. We were a new nation. वो था that Nehruvian zeal was there. They were driven by idealism. Maybe they believed in many of the wrong ideas, but the point is they wanted to actively make a difference. And one could say about the present generation that everything is instrumental. It's just another career. It's not necessarily like that. The design of the state attracts a different kind of person to the job. But, that middle generation, the KP Krishnans and maybe Vijay Kelkar, of course, would be a holdover of my dad's generation only. But KP Krishnan and perhaps those, in the 10 years below him had that idealism, many of them, as you put it, and yet they weren't that Nehruvian generation either. So I wonder, where does the idealism come from? Is it partly sometimes a function of age? That if you are young, you're just looking to get ahead, and then you reach a certain point and you realize ki sab kuch to mil gaya, and now what? And then you start thinking of, you move up the pyramid, as it were. Is that the case? Or is it the case that 95% of people in any job, and the percentage will be lower for you because you've had the selection bias of being where you are, where more people are purpose driven. But 95% of people in any job are just ticking boxes and going through the motions. They don't really care. So when you describe these young IAS officers as, not having, you can't place them on the capitalism, socialism spectrum, it's because that it's a waste of their time to think about all of that stuff. They don't need to, they need to tick whatever boxes they need to do, stay on the right side of whoever is in charge, plan their next Davos trip, etc., and whatever it takes to get there. So what is your sense of that? And it's a larger question. It's not a question that anyone is an expert in. I'm just like wondering that where does idealism come from? Where does purpose come from?
I think two are different. One is idealism, which is that, do you truly value ideas? Okay. That, or do you believe that everything is a given and everything was meant to be the way it is, So I think that is, I would take them as two separate questions. Purpose is very individual specific, maybe being good at your job gives you a sense of purpose. Maybe your job doesn't give you a sense of purpose and it's actually playing music in the evening and getting better at it gives you a sense of purpose. Maybe reading books just gives you a sense of purpose. So that is different. But I honestly think that people underrate the value of ideas, and that undermines idealism. You can be idealistic if you actually value ideas, and if you value the contrary idea as well, if you believe that the contrary idea is important enough, but guess what, I have a better one, you have to be thinking constantly about uh, what made it possible to organize a society the way it is. And I think, generally speaking, maybe capitalism puts you in that stupor. Maybe this is what Marx was referring to as alienation, which is that you stop valuing ideas for what they are, and you think that this is the routine and this is what it is, and maybe 90% of the people are that way. And I would attribute that a lot to partly your lived reality. I mean, and partly because, I don't know, you don't read enough. I don't know, like, reading, of course, suggests, emphasizes, the value of ideas. So idealism is something that maybe we don't find it amongst the young because they're too preoccupied with other things, and I generally think the value of ideas is something that we don't speak enough about. Purpose is, I think it's age driven. At different stages of your life, different things drive you, different things give you a sense of purpose, and I'm hoping it's that is what I'm seeing in the difference between the young IAS officers and the older IAS officers, right? What drives the older ones is the desire to leave a legacy, the desire to leave a reputation, whereas what drives the younger ones is just to get the next best posting. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I was just thinking that they're two different things.
Questions don't have answers. They only have more questions, ideally, right? So, so that's leading me to another one, which is about, again, I'm thinking aloud, but it strikes me that you could say that there are two kinds of idealism. And one kind of idealism is where you are enraptured by ideas, and that intellectual quest is what fuels you, and therefore you're driven by that, and that's where idealism comes from. But another kind of idealism is almost the opposite, in the sense that it is like a lazy passion. You have a fervor, but the fervor is not so much for ideas in the abstract, but particular ideas in the concrete. So what happens is, you're trying to explain the world, you come across, a set of ideas or a framework that appears to explain it, and that's it. Your cognitive work is over. For the rest of your life, that is the one hammer with which you will beat every nail, and you become idealistic about that. So Lenin would be an idealist in Marx's ideas, for example, and alas, many people still are today. And that's one kind of idealism, where you choose a cause, and then it is like a tribe. You are in that thing, and you're idealistic, and you're full of, there's this old quote about how the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I forget what the quote says about the best, but the best are just like, whatever, not really engaged. And that's why the world gets where it were. And I think there are those two kinds of idealism, and one kind of idealism really springs from intellectual laziness, from this desire in your own eyes and in the eyes of the world to be doing important things or to be aiming towards something. And sometimes it's well intentioned, but sometimes it is wrong minded, because you're not really always challenging your own priors. And therefore, that better kind of idealism that you and I aspire towards, I would imagine, requires not just a willingness, but a drive towards discomfort, towards always making yourself uncomfortable and questioning your priors, and getting into arguments which don't have easy answers, etc., etc. So, from observation, what is your thinking on that? Because again, selection bias, I think you and I are more likely to have experienced more people like that than are actually out there in percentage terms. But for me, I still find them vanishingly small, vanishingly small. Most people either don't care about the world, or to the extent that they care about the world, they care about an image of the world they painted when they were 18 or 20 or whatever. And everything is just, confirmation bias and incremental additions to that, but nothing else. But the task of being an intellectual and an idealist in that better sense is the task of always, stripping yourself bare again and again.
Yeah, so I think there's one word which explains this, which is curiosity, right? Now, just for Vladimir Lenin, by the way, towards the end of his life, he did start questioning the value of the communist cause, and he did start valuing the market and seeing that actually central planning is not the answer to everything. So even an idealist as strong as an ideologue called Vladimir Lenin actually started questioning his priors. But to come back to your point, right? I think it's about curiosity. What fuels your curiosity? A lot of the times we become prisoners. There are two things. One is cognitive laziness, which is what you are referring to, where people become prisoners of their own ideas. The second is you've actually entrenched yourself in a community that is just reinforcing everything that you already believe, and you believe that there is no world beyond this. So that is the classic echo chamber effect. And the third, I would say, is that actually you positioned yourself in the public so much for one particular viewpoint that it's very hard for you now to accept, to even convince yourself that, you know what, that viewpoint deserves to be more nuancedly stated, or it's plain wrong. And then you just double down on what you was thinking already, because it's too expensive now to go back on what you already said. I think all these three effects may actually affect idealism generally, even amongst the idealists. You're right. Maybe the people that we meet overwhelmingly happen to be idealists who may fall into one of these three categories or may not. But the rest of the world. So I would say that even I find it hard to believe that people don't think as much about the world. Sometimes I believe that they just don't tell me about it because they believe I'm too opinionated and they just don't want to get into fights. Who wants to get into an uncomfortable situation over dinner? I think people are largely non-confrontational, and having difficult conversations, etc., is just either they just don't want to get into that conversation. I don't think that they don't have an opinion on what the world should be like. We otherwise wouldn't have the kind of rhetoric that we see around current Indian elections and majoritarian outcomes. I think enough people feel strongly enough about who should rule them and how should the state regulate buildings and terraces and signals and spitting on the road. And people have very strong opinions about these kind of things, but they just don't want to think deeply enough, or they don't want to get into uncomfortable arguments with people like us who are, I would say, on the more vocal side of what we believe the world should look like.
The weirdest pejorative in the world is the word opinionated. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah. So my good friend Pranay Kotasane introduced me to this phrase, not his original phrase. He was quoting someone: "Strong opinions weakly held." And I absolutely love that. That is an opinionated and open person. And I'm now again thinking aloud and wondering if all of these people in our family WhatsApp group or our dinner tables who may avoid certain subjects with us actually have weak opinions strongly held. And that kind of can then lead to the tyranny of mediocrity, where you are surrounded by people who strongly hold weak opinions because it's convenient for them, and there's no cost to it, and etc., etc., and we get trapped by that. Like Paul Graham wrote this great essay called The Four Quadrants of Conformism, where he spoke about the intensity of your belief and whether you were a conformist or a non-conformist. And in his articulation, the most dangerous kind of person was the person who is the aggressively conventional minded, right? You are conventional minded, which means you're not really questioning anything. You're going with the flow and you're aggressive about it. And they are the enemies of progress. And we are surrounded by them on social media and etc., etc. And there are aggressively conventional minded on both the right and the left. So they'll believe opposite things, but they're believing what are conventions of the tribe. And, discussion sort of becomes impossible. So I'm just kind of thinking aloud, and obviously in family circumstances it's best not to fight, because like, what the hell, sometimes human relationships matter more, and I have many friends and people I'm close to who believe very different things. Though I think even there are litmus tests and certain things which would be off limits for me. Like, is that the case with you? Like, would you stop being friends with someone if they did X, and if so, what is that X?
So I always used to believe that I'm never going to sacrifice friendships over politics, but I'm increasingly coming to the conclusion that I just cannot be friends with a person who believes one thing or another. Maybe it's a reflection of me and my level of, my tolerance levels or my patience levels or whatever you call it, my openness, so to speak. So it's funny. Just a couple of days ago, I think over coffee or something, I was discussing with a group of friends, would you date a person of the opposite political ideology? And what they said is that actually this question is much more relevant in the United States, not so much in India. Because in the United States, it's very well articulated. If you're a Democrat, you stand for certain values. If you're a Republican, you stand for certain values. In India, whether you support Shiv Sena, Uddhav Thackeray, Shiv Sena, Eknath Shinde, BJP, INC, NCP. BJP is a bit of a, out there, but NCP. I mean, what do they stand for? And would you really give up on a good potential mate opportunity simply because you believe they stand for something that, for a party that actually doesn't itself stand for anything, right? So maybe positions in India, except in some matters, are not as deeply thought about or clearly articulated. Okay, so on the question of would I actually stop being friends with a person because of a certain kind of conduct? I think, knowing me, I would stop, but when I say stop, I mean I stop interacting and I stop hanging out. But would I really pick a fight with that person over something like this? I increasingly don't have the capacity to do it, because actually their position is not even well thought out, like you said. So it's kind of pointless having a discussion with them. But yes, is there a yes or no answer to this? You force me to think in absolutes, which is hard. I don't know. I would definitely reduce my level of interaction. I'm already doing that. So,
Yeah, and I also think about sort of how ideas and values interact with each other. For example, the position that I have come through in terms of what do I believe in is that as far as facts are concerned, I'm open, change my mind. There's no view of the world that I'm going to hold on to dogmatically. As far as values are concerned, I'm completely rigid and dogmatic by now. That there are things I value like individual freedom and like consent, and I'm against coercion, and I'm dogmatic about those. But as far as the facts of the world are concerned, fine, change my mind, I'm completely open. But the two bleed into each other,
yeah.
right? Like at a recent party, I got mad at an acquaintance because he was arguing for degrowth. Right. And now it's no more a battle of ideas for me when you talk about degrowth. Degrowth would hurt the poor in a country where it is important to get people out of poverty. It is okay for you to sip your single malt in an air-conditioned room and say, oh, we should have degrowth. But it hurts the poor. It's a worst form of sort of coercion and keeping people in poverty in that manner. And therefore it bleeds into values. And I don't know what to make of that. And I keep telling myself that, listen, when you're arguing ideas, because I only get emotional when it comes to values, and I can lose my temper and kind of lose control. When it comes to ideas, I don't really care. I'm this passionate. We'll talk about the facts of the world. But they bleed into each other either way, right? So how is that for you? Do you think about these distinctions, and have you ever gotten emotional about ideas and got mad where what is otherwise a standard argument is kind of happening? How does that sort of work?
Yeah, so I like the typology that you set out, right? There's values, ideas, and facts. Okay, on facts, I think it's obvious that everybody should be open to listening to.
But no.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, that is so true. So just yesterday, I was at an old relative, 95-year-old. I'd just gone to pay a visit, and she told me BJP won from my constituency. I said, no, that's not true. The person who won was from Eknath Shinde, Uddhav Thackeray's party, which means she was not in alliance with BJP. She just refused to believe me. She's like, no. So yes, I mean, maybe it's the age factor or whatever. Yes, you're absolutely right. There are some people who don't want to learn facts. Ideas and values. Okay, good point. What is happening with me is that, except for the group of people who actually think deeply about ideas and who, to put it in your phraseology, have strong ideas strongly held, I don't end up talking about ideas to many people, because simply either I don't want to create that confrontational situation, or they don't want to create one with me, and therefore I don't end up talking about ideas and values so much, because I feel like the average person of my age who's in the same economic class as mine is extremely statist. It's very hard for me to convince them why terrace gardens shouldn't be regulated. It's very hard for me to convince them why people urinating in the public or spitting in the public shouldn't be publicly flogged. Okay, these views are very casually held and they are thrown around like nobody's business. And at some point, it's fatigue. And you just, that's what I'm saying, that I end up in reducing my interaction with them. But I don't really go around. I mean, it has to get really bad where where I'm being prodded to give my ideas. So I'll give you one example. At a family dinner once, the topic came up about inefficient courts. Okay, and how judges misbehave and lawyers also misbehave, and I mean, everybody's just doing whatever the hell that comes to their mind in a courtroom. Now, most of the people in this family group that I'm talking about are senior counsel or are extremely entrenched in the conventional legal fraternity. And I knew that whatever I say will offend them, so I did not say anything. And then they, no, no, but tell us what you think, tell us what you think. And I said that I think there should be cameras in courtrooms, because that way the litigant gets to see how the lawyer's behaving, how the judge is behaving, whether he wants to change his decision on the lawyer. Right now, the litigant has no way of knowing. And that deeply offended their sense of justice. They said that how can there be cameras in the courtroom? You're policing the judge. I said, but even our parliamentarians get policed. We have courtrooms in the parliament. They may well be performing for the cameras, how do you know this? And at some point, that performance will stop, because you end up being your natural self. You cannot keep on being somebody who you're not for a very, very long time. And that broke into a family fight of, I've got to say, disproportionate proportions, where, so after that experience, I feel like on ideas and values, unless you want to have a meaningful discussion with me, I will generally not bring it up in social situations.
Apart from the assertion that no, there should be no cameras in courtrooms, what is an argument against having cameras in courtrooms?
That judges will perform for the camera. That was their answer. To which I said, but beyond a point, they cannot perform. So in the long run, that performance will stop. They'll start getting immune to the camera, the way you and I are immune to, those scanners, metal detectors when we enter malls and stations. I feel like even if that metal detector wasn't there, I would probably stop at the entrance of the metro station for half a second, because I'm so conditioned by it. I mean, you just it becomes a part of your daily life. And so their main response was that you'll end up making judges perform for the camera. And then one thing leads to another. And then coming back to the black sheep part, right? Which is that the Gujarati family doesn't understand what I do for a living. So they're like, oh, you don't even come to a courtroom. How do you know what a courtroom looks like and what goes on in a courtroom? And I mean, the natural answer to that is that I don't have to be an amoeba to understand an amoeba, to study an amoeba, I mean, so discussing ideas, values, especially today in Indian society, on the dinner table is not as easy as it used to be. In fact, my family, if you think, my immediate family also, it's highly polarized. So two people in my family are extremely pro BJP, two people are pro Congress. One is is a swing voter, willing to be swayed anyway. So, but these are not easy conversations these days. I don't know if it was always that way, because it seems to me that at least in my consciousness, this is the first time that, since the time I was capable enough of understanding the world, the first time an authoritarian government, a majoritarian government, has come to power for so long. Otherwise, I remember my childhood as being the coalition years, and I've never had to have these debates with so much aggression. I've never seen these debates with so much aggression, even amongst my family members. And I wonder if it is a function of today's time, or was it always this way and you just happen to be part of it much more now?
I think it's absolutely a function of today's time, in the sense that back in the day, there was no reason to be aggressively tribal. I think social media has, increased the incentives of being performative, the Facebook like, the Twitter retweet. And therefore, and the other thing that happens interestingly is that, thank God there was no social media when I was 20, because I had the weirdest views, and I was also reading Marx, by the way. And the thing is, today what happens is a young person goes online. They are comparing their real lives with the projected lives of others, but that's a whole different problem. Jonathan Haidt has written so much about it in the construct of Instagram. But what happens in terms of political rhetoric is that it is so tempting for you to join one of the tribes online, whether on the left or the right, and then you want to raise your status in that tribe. So you're signaling, you're attacking people on the other side, on your own side, for not being pure enough, never engaging with nuance, because you'll immediately be cancelled by everyone as a centrist, and you get into that sort of loop. And the worst part is that if you're 19 and you've gone online and you joined one of these tribes and you express your opinion and you express some random thing that you just thought, a weak opinion weakly held, but you get 50 retweets and then somebody attacks you and then you double down because you want more of that validation. And then that casually expressed opinion, which could have been one of 100 contradictory casually expressed opinion, becomes who you are because you've doubled down and you've owned it. And I think that's a great tragedy. And, we don't know the counterfactuals, but I think that people get hardened in these sort of positions. I mean, there is therefore a part dependence to the virtue signaling, and that to me is horrendous. I can't fathom it. Like if I was forced to become the same person I was at 20, how do you grow? How do you sort of get out of that? So I think that what has happened is that there is just more expressive tribalism these days, and I think that's going to also obviously come in the way of families, because just thinking aloud again, back in the day, you're restricted to communities of circumstance, and the closest, tightest community is the family. Today, you've got communities of choice all over the place. So maybe that, places a discount value on the value of, what's happening at the dinner table. So
on the tribalism point, maybe we should tell Pranay that we found a new term, public position irrevocably held. You just cannot go back on it for a strong week. It's irrevocable, Abhi.
Yeah, tumne bata diya. Abhi the screenshots will circulate for 30 years, I still get people screenshotting things I wrote like 10, 15 years ago, and it's just like, and anyway, so moving on, I'm going to come back to the engine room question, because this is something I'm deeply fascinated with about how do the governments actually work? How does a process of change happen? Like, can you, if you don't mind taking a specific example, can you pick a specific example and talk about its evolution through the corridors of power, and what were the kind of conversations that were had? What were the kind of processes? What was a typical day of your life in the Ministry of Finance like?
Yeah. So, the way governments actually work is through, as Max Weber described in 19th century, which is through files. I think even Dr. K.P. Krishnan might have told you that everything in government moves through file notings. So, the way this at least worked in my time is that the home of ideas typically is not a bureaucrat's office. The home of ideas is a paper written somewhere, or a practice adopted in another jurisdiction, or a reaction to a scam, and then the bureaucrat has to go and look for a solution. And once there is a set of solutions that are presented to him or her, it normally starts with, in my time, the person who was responsible, it's mostly the joint secretary. So there are 3 levels. There's at the senior decision-making level, there's the joint secretary, there's the additional secretary, and there's the secretary. The secretary is the topmost officer in the pyramid who reports to the minister, right? But the minister also, I've seen the minister interact with the joint secretary and the additional secretary as well. Ideas originate at the joint secretary level, where he picks up, where basically there's a felt need, ye karna hai. Now, that ye karna hai might have come from either the secretary or the minister. How did the minister or the secretary get to know it? He either read about a problem being highlighted in a newspaper. So it is very normal for a secretary level person and the minister to read newspaper op-ed columns and figure out what is it that is going wrong in the portfolio that I'm in charge of, and just send that newspaper article to the secretary that what is to be done. The secretary in turn sends it to downward, pushes it down the chain, saying what is to be done. And the joint secretary is a person who's much more in touch with the industry, etc. And he either calls up people who he knows and says, what should we do about this? So for example, let's take, it's been a while. Honestly, I'm not able to remember a single tangible proposal that I could see through the entire life cycle. But it's the proposal is then typed up by one of the officers who is below in rank to the joint secretary. The joint secretary signs the file. Now, if that proposal requires coordination with other departments, it goes to them. And then it is elevated up. Every single officer to whom the proposal goes at the joint secretary level has to give his comments and sign it. He may choose not to sign it and keep, actually the best if he doesn't agree, he can keep sitting on it and nothing moves forward. Uh, and then the file goes to the additional secretary. Additional secretary in turn takes it to the secretary. Secretary in turn takes it to the minister. So it's really just, I know this sounds really boring, but it is what it is, and which is that all of government moves through files and file notings.
So this sounds incredibly scary, but it conforms to that old stereotype also, because it seems here that there are multiple points of failure. That anywhere down the line, one random guy cannot sign the file and then is kind of just stuck there. And that to make anything happen, you actually need a perfect storm. Now, on the one hand, this is great because it just slowness of the process builds in certain checks and balances. Time is going to pass, so that's a good thing. But on the other hand, where there is political will, like what Modi did with demonetization, for example, the entire process is bypassed and you just do whatever the hell you want. So how was it? Like, from the first perspective, I can just say that, oh my God, it's very dispiriting because nothing will ever get done here. And the second perspective is that it's the arbitrary whim of the guy in charge, and, how do you manipulate that? And, as a policy person, would you not just think about the value of the ideas that you're presenting, but would you also have to strategize on how to present it depending on the person you're presenting it to?
Yeah, so I think depending on the timing, often the push comes from the minister. Okay. And that in turn is used to push everybody else to give their views. And generally, the minister will not say sign the file, he'll just tell you, give me your views. And so I don't think anybody can be indefinitely sitting on things which require more expedited work. But yes, on reforms that are non-urgent, yes, this can very well happen if it is non-urgent. See, the one way to think about this, and this is, I saw this on numerous occasions during my time at the North Block, is that the Joint Secretary will generally say, let's put this out for public consultation and see what people say. So to that extent, I would say my experience wasn't as confirming to the stereotype story that we are told in a Yes Minister, etc. I personally value the slowness of this process because I feel that at every level, there is a check. Now, you may not agree with the person's views, but if he writes down his views, at least the next officer can say that I do not agree with this. And that brings the people to the table to discuss this out. I think often what might happen is that it's just the reform, the timing of it is lost, or for whatever reason, it's not an urgent reform. And that's where the files may get lost. But otherwise, largely, in my opinion, this process works okay. Yeah. The slowness of it is particularly important. Otherwise, you may well have an overnight decision such as demonetization and 21-day lockdown and things like that. So to that extent, the process is useful. I'm just thinking of one example if I can give you, but I can't think of any right now.
One of the ways I have of identifying tribalism is if you have identified yourself as either pro-Modi or anti-Modi. If you're anti-Modi, the question I'll ask you is, tell me one good thing he did. And if you're pro-Modi, I'll say, okay, what do you disapprove of among the things he's done? And the easy answer for an anti-Modi person like me, when it comes to good things, will be inflation targeting or the insolvency and bankruptcy code, of which you are someone who worked closely with that. You and Susan and the entire team, it was your baby. And so just as, for me, that's in a sense a perfect example of a great reform. So take me through that process. What was it like from, at what stage did you enter the picture? Who were the different parties involved in that? How did that kind of play itself out?
So I was working with NIPFP, which in turn was working with the Ministry of Finance in 2014-15. And therefore, I happened to be in the early years of this government where reforms was a priority in itself. Reforms were not in response to any specific crisis. They were already sitting in the pipeline and they just had to be pushed through, right? So I think the insolvency and bankruptcy code is often described by many people as a reaction to the NPA crisis, which I think is a very wrong positioning of because of the way the law is. Even inflation targeting, right? It is not a new idea. It was sitting in the pipeline for quite some time, and it was already approved by the previous government, if I'm not mistaken.
It was, yeah.
And it was just about the file being signed by the minister. So it all comes down to whether the minister thinks this is important enough to sign it. And he did think it was important. Arun Jaitley was the finance minister when I was there. And I think from 2016 onwards is when the pace slowed down, because actually in the first 3 years you had land reform, you had monetary reform, you had bankruptcy reform, but somehow from 2016 the pace slowed down. I don't know what went wrong. So without
there's a story I like to tell, so I'll quickly tell that for those of my listeners who may not have heard it. And it's something I learned from doing episodes. And what happened with inflation targeting was that the whole thing was there at Chidambaram's desk, and then Mr. Chidambaram's stand to KP Krishnan was that, no, listen, as a courtesy, there are elections, let's leave it for the next government. So Krishnan takes it to Jaitley, and he gives it one evening to Jaitley. The next morning Jaitley says, let's go ahead. And Krishnan is like, whoa, hold on a bit. I totally agree with it. I want to do it, but this is huge. This basically redefines the RBI completely. So you want to take some time to read it. And Jaitley is offended by this, as if, he hasn't read it. And he says that, listen, if our country's finest legal and financial minds have agreed to this, I have nothing to add. And he meant Chidambaram and Manmohan. And I find this a very moving story. And a similar thing happened with the NPS, the new pension scheme, the Vajpayee government handing it over to the next government.
Yes.
And the exact same thing happened. And you're right that 2016 it stops and it goes to hell. And 2015, in fact, at some point, and it kind of goes to hell for political reasons. And to me, that's a great tragedy, because all through all of these years of shrill politics and blah, 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 you had politicians talking to each other, parties talking to each other, understanding that there was a greater job they were doing, which was the good of the country. And that's, kind of completely eroded. So you mentioned that, so I thought I should throw that story in there, because, we had times like that and we had leaders like that.
Yeah, so I think the sense of continuity completely stopped maybe at some point in mid 2016. And maybe that's got to do with the continuity even within BJP. Who knows, right? So that was also the time when I think a lot of senior leaders of the BJP expired, and maybe that just kind of gave the sense that no need for more continuity and we can do exactly what we want. But I don't know, to be honest. I mean, everything that we say here is speculation about what really happened post 2015, post 2016. But it seems to me that once these laws were enacted, you got to have a bureaucracy that will actually implement them, right? So maybe one way to think about this is to take heart from the fact that they've not been rolled back. I mean, it's a very low standard.
Yeah, but that's kind of inertia, right? Once it happens, who's going to make the effort? And so tell me about the bankruptcy law. What was it like? Whenever I've in the past heard you or Susan talking about it, it is with a passion that people generally don't have for policy. Musicians have it for the music they create, and writers have it that I worked on this novel for 7 years, but,
So I got involved in the much later stages of its implementation, okay? And that was really my beat, because you get to work on setting up courts and regulators to enforce and implement the law. And what are the problems with the current set of regulators and courts, and therefore you want to avoid those, and you have the chance to design institutions that avoid those. But it seemed to me that once the law was enacted, and the first 6, 8, 9 months had gone and a regulator was set up, after the first 12 cases that went to the NCLT, which RBI sent, which were the large NPAs, and I think Ajay and Susan have written a lot about this, about how they ended up overloading the system before it could even find its feet. At some point, the enthusiasm for it was lost, and the biggest evidence of this was not notifying half the law. So the first half of the law deals with insolvency of corporations, okay? And the second half of the law deals with bankruptcy of individuals. Now, both are equally important, but somehow they never found the political will to notify the second part of the law. So what we have on our statute book, only half of it really is notified today and is being applied. So, but the work that I was involved in involved designing a regulator. So exactly everything that we discuss in the first half of this episode, which is that how do you really even need an independent regulator for bankruptcy? It seems to me no, there is no logic. What is the conflict of interest in the government itself having a department regulating bankruptcy? There is no conflict of interest, except that okay, public sector banks, so maybe they'll be more creditor friendly, but the law is anyway creditor friendly. So, but now, like I said, regulators are a given and they're inevitable. And so you just take it as a given. Maybe there's some benefit to continuity of people who are within the regulator and things like that. So I was involved in designing the regulator, and there we wanted to make sure that to the extent possible, we abide by the separation of powers principle. Now, first of all, what does this bankruptcy regulator do? Okay, it regulates, it makes rules and regulations for how once a company goes into insolvency, what do the shareholders have to do? What do the creditors have to do? What does the management have to do? Also, the law creates a class of insolvency professionals who are regulated people and who are supposed to take over once the company goes into insolvency. All of this was very similar to what a SEBI does and what an IRDAI does. And so the idea was, now that we make when we design a regulator, we don't follow that inertia and cookie cutter models of existing regulators, and we provide for a separate quasi-judicial function which is independent of the regulation making function, which is independent of the licensing function. So all those things we try to build into the design of the regulator. And so if you think about it, IBBI, which is the bankruptcy regulator, is the only regulator that has actually issued regulations on how it will put all its regulations through a cost and benefit analysis, how it will actually do the public consultation. No other regulator in India has done this. And at the cost of sounding immodest, I've got to say that, it is a whole lot of work that basically has fed into this philosophy of how to build a regulator. And the next regulator that they build using IBBI as a cookie cutter, hopefully will continue to have these features. That was the early work. The next kind of work we did on the insolvency and bankruptcy code is figuring out how insolvency cases go through the court process. We all know that courts are a problem. So our puzzle was, but what in the data tells us that this is a problem? Where do we fix? What is the bottleneck? Why are cases taking so long? So we traced the life cycle of each and every insolvency case that went through the tribunal in the first year. And we created an open access data set of how much time did it take in different stages. And for me, that was, if there is one piece of work that I absolutely think, if I could give its copyright in my will to somebody, I would actually give that piece of work copyright to my most precious child, because I feel like, because that got us thinking about court cases as life cycles, not as courts as organizations that have a judicial vacancy problem or, an infrastructure problem or a finance problem. No, you've got to start from the basic, which is that if you claim that tribunals and courts are problems, are you able to give us enough data about what in the life cycle of the case is the problem? So it's always one kind of work leads to another. Your research never ends at, if I have to do something about bankruptcy, it will end at bankruptcy. It creates segues for the next area of work. And that took me to courts and thinking about courts from a data perspective and things like that. So yeah, bankruptcy work, although I was involved in the last stages, actually it gave me the food for thought for all the future work that we ended up doing on courts.
You are one of the giants on whom future generations will stand when they design their future regulatory bodies. We'll talk about courts after the break, but a larger question before that. That earlier you spoke about how you'll have WhatsApp uncles who will ask you, why should terrace gardens not be regulated? And similarly, those same WhatsApp uncles will tell you that, actually we have good laws, but we enforce them badly. Laws are fine. So my question to you is that, how much of the enforcement actually comes from the drafting of the laws itself, the language that is used and the detail that is gone into, how much of the enforcement pressure can be taken on that itself. So state capacity is not such a problem, number one. And number two, that is it important while drafting a law to keep in mind what likely enforcement is going to be given state capacity and then draft it accordingly, so you don't aim for a best solution which will work in a utopian framework, but you aim for an optimal solution for that particular sort of situation.
Okay, so what you're really asking me is that to what extent can we explain the quality of enforcement by the law,
Yeah.
right? Okay. Okay. So there are two kinds of laws in India. You can easily classify laws into those which give excessive discretion to the state to choose when to enforce versus not. And then there is a second law which basically has no means of enforcing itself. Okay. So if you take something like the Prevention of Money Laundering Act or the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act or even the SWALTADA and all those laws, APSPA, for example, just because it is written that it is a crime to do XYZ, it doesn't mean the executive has the obligation to enforce that. The executive chooses which cases to take and which cases not to take. And therein lies the rub, which is that if the law gives discretion to the executive to pick and choose what it wants to enforce versus not, I mean, you are really setting yourself up for disaster. You're setting yourself up for the law being used exactly for the purposes which it is not meant to be used. Okay. On the other hand, if you have a law which sets out the principles on which it is very clear what is a crime, what is not, what considerations should weigh with the executive when it chooses to enforce something versus not, what considerations should weigh with the executive on the quantum of fine that it enforces versus not, I think that would be an ideal law. But the only way to kind of take account of state capacity is by building in these principles into the law itself, so that the executive doesn't have to apply its mind and explain why it chose to enforce against some kinds of seditious speech, but not another kind of seditious speech and things like that. So the classic example that is normally given is the criminalizing check bouncing. Now, if you think of a check is really a contract. And if a check I write to you bounces, it means I violated my contract to you. In no sane view of the world can this be a criminal offense. It's a contractual obligation that I have breached against you. It has no public damage. It causes no damage to the public. And therefore, when you criminalize check bouncing, the question is, do you have the prosecution capacity to take these cases through? No, you don't. Everybody knows that. But the state is wise enough to know that our process is so much of a punishment that the threat of an FIR for your check, for bounce check, may actually help solve these disputes under the threat of the law, right? So I would say this is a very realist view of things, which is that people often negotiate things under the threat of the law. The law is not being used to solve the problem of bouncing of checks. It is being used to help negotiate and allow one party to actually just force a settlement out of the other party. And so I feel on your question of, is there a relationship between enforcement and the quality of the law? I think definitely there is. The more discretion the law gives, the harsher the enforcement is. Actually, it endangers the weakest capacity, who is in weakest parties who are in no position to defend themselves against the state and against the stronger party that the law is going to be used against. You almost invariably know that, which is why stand-up comedians crack jokes and remain in jail for a much longer time than, I don't know, TV anchors who say much more offensive things and continue to hold, even if they are arrested, they're released the next day. So you know who the law is going to be used against. The way to think about this is, increasingly we must move to a situation where less and lesser things are criminalized. That's I think the easiest way to address the question of state capacity versus what should be written in the law. I mean, the lesser and lesser you criminalize things, the lesser and lesser scope for its abuse, and you figure out a way to make people incentivize people from doing the wrong things without really criminalizing it. You don't have the capacity to enforce it. Even if you're doing it in good faith, you know that after you there will be somebody who will use it for precisely the things that this law is not meant to address. So
Bhargavi, we may not have state capacity, but we have coffee capacity, and we'll take a quick break and perhaps have some more coffee. Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I loved the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercised my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm still here with Bhargavi. You cannot regulate the duration of my podcast. It will be as long as I feel like. The Seen and the Unseen and terrace gardens must forever go unregulated. And by the way, when WhatsApp uncles argue for terrace gardens being regulated, what is your argument against it? Because I guess that could be a great general purpose argument against all nonsense regulation.
So the thing is that, to help to see why they're saying terrace gardens should be regulated, because they are really irritated by a certain kind of problem that they have been facing. It's their lived reality. So to convince them that regulation is not the answer to terrace gardens is very hard. You have to start from the framework of why the state should regulate versus not. And this is not a market failure. And that if enough people actually believe that the value of a badly kept terrace garden is, it's better to spend on a well-kept terrace garden. That I can't even believe I'm doing this. It's better to spend on a well-kept terrace gardens than a whole bunch of buildings having badly kept terrace gardens, which actually reduces the aesthetic beauty of your building. Then you'll have well-kept terrace gardens, or that you allow more gardeners to come into your societies and let them tend to the garden, and you don't only have empaneled gardeners and things like that. I mean, it's just you don't have an answer to this. To a person who believes that terrace garden should be regulated, it's very hard for me to convince him that state regulation is not the best answer to every problem that you face from 8 a.m. in the morning to 8 p.m. in the evening. It's just hard. You don't have the argument because you've got to start from scratch. Also, it depends on the person. A lot of the times people are open to listening to a counter view. Many a times people are not. And I just played by the way. I see how fatigued I am. I see how open the opposite person is to listening to what you have to say.
I love the phrase empaneled gardener. And I think, terrace gardens could easily fit into like a J.G. Ballard dystopian novel. He had a novel about a person stuck on a traffic island with, just traffic going all around, and they're there for days and they're living there. And dystopian apartment blocks featured in his work. So I'll link J.G. Ballard from the show notes as well. Read fiction. That is where all of the real world is kind of contained. Let's talk about the law. I mean, I've sort of had episodes on it from different perspectives, but way back in the hoary past. And like at one level, I like to say, and I think you'd agree that it's true, that in India, you don't really have a rule of law. Maybe some privileged elites like us can think of something like the rule of law if something goes wrong with us. But for 95% of the people, if not more, there really is no reliable rule of law, and you're just surviving by social conventions and mores as far as they take you, and maybe just inertia. And that's a great tragedy. And part of the reason for the apathy most people feel towards the law is the terrible state that it's in, that you have legends of cases dragging. I think in an earlier episode, someone had told me about a case that has dragged on since the year 1300. I don't know how that's possible, but there's something in the Indian courts to that effect. I think Alok Prasanna Kumar, perhaps, in an episode I did with him 6 years ago. So, give me a sense of what I kind of just articulated, the folk version of the problem, that there are tens of thousands of cases, lakhs of cases which are just piled up. Prisons are full of under trials who've been there for years, and etc. etc. And then, the deeper look that you actually, took at that once you got into it.
Right. So, on whether rule of law exists or not, no rule of law can exist unless there's an efficacious remedy to enforce it, right? It's pointless writing thousands of pages of laws with, great virtues, etc. If there's no court to enforce it,
That's really
it's,
what I meant.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. For most people, approaching the court is like a last resort. Arguably, it should be, because there should be better ways where people negotiate amongst themselves and find cosient solutions towards their problems, as opposed to using the state coercion and then going to the court to enforce that state coercion. I think where it becomes really important, there are two ways of thinking about it. Is where you're involved in a dispute with the state. Okay, so the state is, it has unlimited resources to keep litigating, and therefore it's cheaper for the state to use the courts. On the other hand, when it's a commercial dispute between two parties, the reason the court shouldn't be the last resort is because invariably one party will be in a stronger position compared to the other. And what you want to try and ensure is that both parties have a fair shot at getting an equitable solution. Okay. Now, the problem with courts is that most of the times we think of courts as some sort of sovereign bodies that are supposed to do this divine duty of dispensing justice. The courts are as much of service providers as a social security administrator. Today, if my Aadhaar authentication fails, I blame UIDAI for not making sure that authentication frameworks are working across its whole line of service providers. On the other hand, when I go to a court, think of the architectural setup of a court. There is a judge who's sitting at a pedestal, everybody else is sitting below. Only certain regulated intermediaries, namely lawyers, have unlimited access to the courts. A lot of what is being said cannot be heard through the courtroom. There is no place for everybody, but that is just the architectural setup of an organization that actually tells you a lot about the organization itself, right? Just a few minutes ago, we spoke about how just the sheer idea of making things simple for the litigant by putting a camera in a court was so vehemently objected to. So that tells us something about what we perceive, what the average person perceives as the role of the court, which is that they see the court as some sort of a sovereign body that is supposed to dispense justice. If our case takes really, really long, we've normalized it to a point where we think that it's only normal that the court should take so long. Whereas if there were as many authentication failures for Aadhaar, we would probably be protesting on the streets, right? But we don't do that for courts because we don't see courts as a service organization. And that is why all the discourse on the court reform focuses on things like judicial vacancy, judgment appointment procedures, etc. I think appointment of judges is important. It is really important, but it affects only the higher judiciary. You're only talking about the judges of the high courts and the Supreme Court. You're really talking about maybe 1% of the entire judicial workforce that is there in the country. The discourse needs to shift, therefore, from, supply side reforms to demand side reforms, which is that what does the average litigant want from a court? Okay. And unless you are able to figure that out, we all will be running in circles कि judicial vacancy को भरना है. We want to increase court infrastructure. Maybe the average litigant is perfectly comfortable with just, video conferencing hearings, and maybe we don't even need to have so much physical infrastructure for the court. Maybe the average litigant is actually more comfortable with written submissions being made and no oral arguments at all, as compared to, this traditional notion of first, I'll get a lawyer and then the lawyer will argue. Maybe the average litigant is very comfortable talking to the judge as compared to a lawyer who he often suspects of being bought over and cheating him and so on and so forth. So I think if we shift the vantage point of courts from, the state, from a state supported body to what the litigant wants, I think we can make much more progress in thinking about court reforms. And that brings me to the point of, okay, so what do litigants really want, right? So there are many countries in which there are regular surveys of litigants done on what do they really want from courts. In some countries, in fact, judges are elected, not even appointed. I wouldn't really go that far as a reform because you're supposed to be a counter majoritarian body. But in India, we don't even have those data collection procedures to figure out what does the average litigant want. Maybe the average litigant actually doesn't mind a slow system because guess what? He's using the system to actually negotiate a better outcome with his counterparty. We don't know these answers. Maybe the average litigant just wants predictability over everything else. Okay, fine. I can have my case disposal after 5 years, but tell me, how is the process going to be organized? At what frequency will I have hearings? Will my hearing take place on the day on which it is scheduled, or will it be adjourned and because the matter will just not reach on that day? How many hearings on an average should a case of my type take? We don't have that basic information, and I think starting from there is one way of looking at court reforms and access to justice, as opposed to starting from believing that this is the problem. Believing that judicial vacancy is the problem. Have we even tried an experiment where you increase the capacity of a court by appointing more judges and figuring out if it actually increased the disposal rate? I don't think we've done such experiments at all. If you haven't done those experiments, how do you know judicial vacancy is the problem? You may say that this is my lived reality, this is the experience that I had. You got to meet higher evidentiary standards if you want public funds to be assigned for appointment of more judges, when actually the people are not even satisfied with the current state of the system, right? So what I think we should be working on is getting much more information about case life cycle data, that if you have a dispute with your landlord today or with your employer today and you file a case, what are your expectations? Within how much time would you get your first hearing? Is that expectation met? Within how much time will you get a disposal? Is that expectation met? How do you expect to be treated by the court staff? How do you expect to be treated by the judge? All of these expectations actually will provide the feedback loops that I think currently courts are not adequately getting, simply because it's not like they don't want to hear it. I just think there's just no systematic way of collecting this information that exists today.
So, from the work that you've done, what are the lessons that you've learned or the insights that you've gained, and what hypothesis would you arrive at from there in terms of the reforms needed? Like, you're right that, traditionally people will say, oh, we need more judges and etc., etc. But, what have you found, and what are the kind of reforms that you think could be a move in the right direction?
Right. So, what we've been doing in the last 3 years at XKDR Forum in Bombay is we've been actually we've said that, look, this is the system as it exists. Okay. Within this system, how do litigants reorient their expectations? So what we did is we did a survey of litigants where we said that if you had a credit contract that is defaulted on, so some a lender has lent money and the borrower has defaulted on it, what are your expectations of the judiciary? Because you know that it will take a long time to resolve this dispute. And actually, it shouldn't be so counterintuitive. Most people said that we know it will take a long time, but we just want predictability. I just want to be able to organize my life such that it doesn't get disrupted because of this case. So, for example, what is the likelihood of getting a first hearing within the first 3 months of me filing a case? Okay. What is the likelihood that the judge will substantively hear in the matter on merits, as opposed to saying, oh, now file the next batch of pleadings, I'll give notice to the other side? What is the likelihood of getting a disposal within the first 1 year, within the second year? And, all of this is just so insightful. Today, if you order any service provider you think of, okay, right from courier services to pizza delivery, you can track minute by minute where the parcel is, where the service, which stage of delivery is the service in. We are just simply not able to do that for courts, and we are not able to give that predictability to litigants. I think just committing to give that predictability in itself will reorient courts towards meeting those goals. So, for example, what we often find is that courts often schedule 100 matters in a day to be heard. When you know that your average capacity to hear a to hear matters is maybe 40 a day. Why would you schedule 100 matters, set up expectations uh, for the litigants, and then, hear only about 40 and 60 are told that actually your case was adjourned to another date? Does it even come up on that other date? It is, I mean, we just need to, as, how do you say, as oppressive as this sounds, we just need to apply the whole management information framework that has been developed for the assembly line to a court process. The assembly line, it's very clear. This is the process to be done at this stage. It must take not more than 1.5 minutes, then go to the next stage. This person does exactly that. So you've got to apply that level of discipline, that information system to a court, to a case that is going through the motions of a court. If a hearing is scheduled today, how many hearings? So the question that I would ask, for example, to meet a litigant's expectations is that if a hearing is scheduled today, what is the probability that it will actually get heard today? How many times are you not meeting that probability? And if you are not, I would actually go on and diagnose that problem, like break it down into part by part and diagnose which part is not functioning as per expectation. That's the way to do it. I mean, supply side has been tried too often, and maybe we can keep trying it, but I don't think it will move the needle too much.
And I would imagine that the unpredictability imposes a massive economic cost, because you and I might choose not to transact in a particular way because if one of us defaults, then we simply don't know what's going to come out of it. Maybe you factor that cost in, the probability of a default, into the arrangements that you made, and that has like an economic cost which is unseen. My question here is, like, I love your framing of what the courts do as essentially a service delivery. They are delivering justice. That's a service that you kind of expect. And when I think of Swiggy and Zomato, yes, you're right. I can, track them minute by minute on my app, and, Instamart and Zepto will, fall over each other and take helicopters to get it here in 12 minutes. And they actually do. But there, the issue is that the incentives are great. I don't need to think about what is their organization design or any of that shit. That's their problem. Their incentives are great. It's a market incentive. They need to make a profit, and that's driving them to give me the best possible service you want. Now, justice is not something that you can really privatize in that manner. So the question that then comes up is that how do you fix the incentives? That is really the worry. I'm sure the supply side capacity can take care of itself if you just get the incentives right. But, how do you fix that? What's the solution there?
So you can privatize justice in the way that arbitration, for example, private arbitrations are entirely privatizing justice. There is no court involved. You and I agree ahead of time that if you and I have a dispute, X person will be appointed as an arbitrator and will resolve that dispute, and we agree to be comply with that. And if either of us defaults in complying with that person's order, the other person can go to court and get that order enforced of the arbitrator. Okay. But that hasn't worked, because guess what? Courts actually don't care so much about competition, like you rightly said. The way to organize the incentive system for judges, in my opinion, is, and there are a lot of papers written on this, on how judges actually care about peer feedback. They do care about what the public thinks of them, although they're not elected, but they do care about things like, if a litigant using my courtroom has given me a bad review, it will affect me. Okay. Often it comes out in the form of contempt petitions, etc., which is, in my opinion, it's trivial. It shouldn't be used. But which is why when you think of court reform from a demand side, from the litigant's perspective, and you start setting up yourself for feedback loops and information systems, at some point that feedback loop will go back to the judge in question, and it will start reorienting his incentives towards serving the beneficiary of this institution, right? So today, to even think of judge level performance parameters being published is sacrilege. Okay, it is no. If we judge level performance parameters are published in the public domain, currently their performance reports go as confidential matters, which go up to the senior judge, and the senior judge reviews the performance of the junior judge. But think of it as being published. One argument against that is that actually this is the this can be used to undermine the independence of the judiciary. Okay. But equally, you could argue that actually it gives feedback to the judge on things like whether he's meeting the expectations of litigants who use his courtroom, and that reorients his incentives to do the right thing. So you're right that there is no way to introduce competition to reorient incentives, but you can set up feedback loops in other ways to motivate judges to meet expectations of litigants. Currently, I mean, I can't. I mean, maybe it's just a thing with hospitals and police stations and judiciary, which is that everybody comes home upset, because those are the places where you go as when you are in a spot. Even if you account for that bias of the kind of places that they are, I don't see any litigant being satisfied with their experience of the courtroom at all.
So, Danny Kahneman in his book Noise and various cognitive psychologists speak of similar things, point to how we imagine a judicial system, and he's, of course, speaking in the context of the US. We imagine a judicial system as being something that works to, the processes are great and everything, and it works so well. And what he points out is that incredibly trivial things can affect judgments of judges, that whether you lost at golf or won on golf on a Sunday can affect the decision you give on a Monday, to the effect of you could either give 2 years or 7 years if those are the min and the max. If you if you and I meet at a cafe for the first time, and I'm more likely to feel warm towards you if I sip a hot beverage as opposed to a cold one. Ridiculous things like that. Humans are flawed in deep ways, and we don't understand our own biases, and there are so many circumstantial factors that come into play. And I just wonder that, number one, if you rationalize the laws that exist, like what is criminal and what is not, at one level, and two, if you how much of it is automatable, that once AI gets into play, not to make the final decisions, obviously humans do that, but once AI gets into play and you're having parameters fed in and out and etc., how efficient can a legal system of the future therefore look if we use all of that? Because what appears to me to be the case is that we have a legal system that is an artifact of the past. It is perhaps no longer relevant in this world. There are better ways of doing things, but we've normalized specific ways of doing things, that we need lawyers, and the lawyer will go to court, and in the court there will be a judge on a pedestal. So how could the system look in the future? And a question I was going to ask separately, but it actually kind of, I think, makes sense to tie it in with this, is a question I've asked in another context to some of my guests, which is that if you reboot civilization, what would so you have humans, but then you reboot civilization, how could the legal system look like today? And the purpose of my asking that question is, I imagine some things would be exactly the same, and therefore we can conclude that those things are things that are inevitable given human nature and the way societies evolve, and other things would be completely missing, and we could assume that they are accidents of history, maybe good ones, maybe bad ones, probably bad ones, and can be done away with, and then we can have a better sense of what is essential and what alternatives are. Because I fear that with the law, as with pretty much everything else around us, we've just normalized an existing form of doing things. We don't even question it at all. And maybe we could question it. Maybe there are other ways of doing things. So these kind of two sort of questions about the role that in a new age, what greater information processing and automation, whether that could kind of help compensate for the human foibles that you have, and, reduce a lot of the friction within the system. Like if you and I have a contract, there are certain terms and conditions, and I default on a payment I'm supposed to make to you. You should be able to automate that kind of decision rather than waste the actual, a human can still give the final judgment. But, so what is sort of your sense, maybe answering the second question first, and just imagine a reboot of civilization. How could a legal system look like? I mean, the whole function of a legal system is to make sure that we can live together without infringing each other's rights and without fighting, that, lives are not nasty, short and brutish. So what is your...
Yeah, so if I had to reboot civilization, then two things, which is that you reduce the power of the state, the discretionary powers given to the state under the law, and that in itself reduces the likelihood of of a person who's aggrieved due to excessive discretion being used and going to court and having to use the judiciary for getting a fair outcome against the state. So if you reboot civilization, definitely the first remedy that you suggested, which is that you reduce the scope of what can be taken to litigation by actually reducing state intervention. That is totally possible. When it comes to commercial disputes, I have a much more pragmatic view of things, which is, I believe I am more pragmatic, which is that commercial disputes are not about state power. Commercial disputes are about power asymmetry between two parties. One of them has the courage to say, look, I'm going to default, you do what you like. Okay. And partly you can do it because the judicial system is really expensive to go to. So there I would say that the state has no role, and really it's a bit of a cycle, because if the judiciary is quick and efficient, then nobody would dare to default. The reason you're able to default is because actually this will take time, and you will get a settlement under the threat of a slow judiciary outside against the weaker party. So I don't know how to solve for that except through reforming court processes, and that is where AI in law comes in, right? Now, having said that, the judiciary is not only about efficiency. The reason we follow a judge's orders is because we trust the system. We believe that the system, if we want to live in the society, actually we should follow court orders. Otherwise, it's not a good thing for society. I mean, there is some trust in the law that makes us respect courts despite everything. Okay, so as much as we want to say that courts are slow and inefficient, the truth is that today I would rather trust the court to make the right decision than say an individually appointed arbitrator, and that is why most of the decisions even go to court. Now, in the legitimacy literature, this is something known as cognitive legitimacy, which is that over the years we are just so used to having a court system that it's very hard for me or you to displace the role of a judge in the dispute, in judging a dispute between ourselves. And I don't know to what extent AI can inspire that confidence. You're right. We should be separating judicial decisions in which, just to keep maintaining that trust, we probably cannot be using AI. But for every other thing, we can probably use AI. We can probably assist the judge using AI. AI tools can be used to summarize pleadings, give a much more reasoned, help judges write their decisions. So I would say that AI tools with a human judge can help increase efficiency. But, all of this is great in the hypothetical world of where we are rebooting civilization. But the truth is we are not. And we have to live in this system and think of solutions within this system. And we have enough inspiration to do that, enough examples, So, for example, it is well known, and I think Aparna Chandra's recent book documents it, which is that in Indian settings, oral arguments have disproportionately affected judge time compared to a lot of developed countries' courts, where oral arguments are actually not the norm, they're the exception. So most judges, for example, in the US, we were dealing with one litigation where to make a case, you have to submit your written submissions. To make a case for taking the judge's time to listen to you, you have to submit another submission that why do you think you need an oral hearing? What is it that you can't already say in written form that you want my time for? And I think those tweaks, etc., can be made even without rebooting civilization. And there I would say that the harder question is, how do you motivate judges? It's a question which you asked, that how do you motivate judges to make these changes? These changes are known, they've been discussed ad nauseum, to be honest. And the hardest question is now not what changes are to be made, but how do we get the system to internalize those changes? They've not internalized it. They don't want to do it. There are just way too many entrenched interests. Who benefits from written submissions alone, right? The lawyers lose out. The judge maybe loses out because, maybe he's much more comfortable in the current scheme of things. He's actually risen in the current scheme of things. So this works for him or her. And very few individual judges would actually have the courage to say that, oral arguments have their place, but guess what? In my courtroom, I'm going to do things in my way, and I'm going to only take written submissions. And oral submissions, I will limit them to 10 minutes, nothing more, right? So even those basic tweaks can increase efficiency. But the big problem is the question of how do we design incentives? And that is why I come from the litigants' feedback loop. You set up litigants' expectations, you publish court performance, benchmark to litigant expectations, and you hope that works as the feedback loop.
So judges want a 5-star rating, so they're,
I think so. I think a judge cares about what his peers think about him.
But so within the system, it's still the same thing. Why should the state resolve itself when, it's against its best interests in a sense, which would apply to most public policy, right? I mean, your typical drive when you're trying to get the state to reform itself is, number one, you want it to reduce its own power, right? So, and its own discretion. And then that becomes a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, no. So does the state benefit from slow courts? Maybe it does. I think even individual litigants benefit from slow courts. It's not just the state. So therefore, whatever this...
Why does the state benefit from slow courts?
The state also is a party to a lot of contracts. The state also defaults, and therefore the states likes being in the system. Often, states litigate in revenue matters where if it loses at the lower tribunal, out of risk aversion, the state appeals, and basically it doesn't want the right outcome. It just wants it to sit there so that, it's noted on the file that the relevant person has actually advised filing an appeal. And, so everybody benefits from slow courts. Okay. So at any given point in time, one of the parties is going to lose, and that party probably benefits from a slow court more than the other. Therefore, where will this incentive for reform come from? There is a lot of work which suggests that speedier courts, there is a correlation between speedier courts and classic growth parameters such as investment, rate of investment, cost of doing business, cost of credit, all of that. But that also doesn't seem to be moving the needle enough because the benefits are too dispersed, right, of fast courts. Where will this come from? I think this will come from litigants, because a litigant who actually wants a faster court is the sufferer. And unless we figure out a way of capturing their expectations and then benchmarking court performance to their expectations, this has got to come from civil society that actually, or researchers which do this, because you're right. In any given point, in any given litigation, one party definitely prefers a slower court. So nobody is incentivized enough, definitely not the state, to do this. Judges are not incentivized enough. Lawyers are not incentivized. It's got to come from somebody who is not affected by any of this, but is still driven enough for a change. And I think that this is where researchers, civil society, academia comes in. They step in and they basically say that we are going to do this job of mapping litigant expectations and then benchmarking court performance to litigant expectations and putting it out in the public domain. You risk contempt. Maybe there's a way to do it in a less controversial way, in a better way, such that this is not used as a tool to undermine the independence of the judge. We've got to think this through, but I think the drive will only come from researchers, civil society. They have a role here. I think they are wasting their time on trivial questions like how do we increase judicial vacancy? These are easy questions. Don't spend your time on that. Figure this out instead.
Is it the case that only great political will can solve it at one shot, and therefore what you want to tackle is not the supply end of the political marketplace but the demand end of the political marketplace? So again, the litigants are people, and if there is enough outcry from there, then supply responds to demand, and then politicians have to kind of wake up and look at it as one win which is possible for them out there. Is that the case, or are you just looking at litigants' expectations, public ratings, changing the incentives for the judges themselves?
So the most well experimented thing is when public ratings improve performance, right? So we rate every service. Even the government has no incentive to improve except elections, but the government also provides services these days, and you can rate that service, and it's all out there for everybody to see. There is a class of repeat litigants that will benefit from a speedier judiciary, okay? And that is creditors. Creditors who lend out loans as part of their business are perpetually facing defaults and are using the courts for some reason or the other. And generally, they don't prefer a slow judiciary. So you could actually galvanize collective action amongst repeat litigants who use the judiciary enough and actually benefit from a speedier judiciary. A one-time entrepreneur who goes to court just for some, vendor dispute or something, the benefit is too dispersed for him to actually galvanize and be part of this action. But repeat litigants who use the judiciary often and benefit from a speedier judiciary are well placed to actually organize this as some form of a collective action.
Money lenders of the world unite.
Oh, yeah, that's my slogan. That's a good one.
Yeah. You've, in a sense, been juggling a couple of things as well in all these years. One is that you have, in a sense, been a practitioner. You've been in the belly of the beast at the Ministry of Finance, and you've been, drafting policy and working on policy after that as well at IGIDR and now at XKDR. At the same time, you also publish papers and do what could be called academic work, academic research. You've got papers with Anirudh Burman on the responsiveness of regulatory agencies, etc., etc. So, how do you think about the balancing of these two? Like, one is knowledge production in a sense, and the other is actually interfacing with arms of the state and doing all the messy negotiations and the dialogues that those involve. So how does it, how difficult are these two to kind of manage together? Do you require different mindsets from them? Are you ever tempted to say that screw it here, I'll just be a full-time researcher and I'll do only this and etc., etc.?
So in many ways, I don't understand this question because I feel that you can't do one without the other. So I feel when you're working on policy, you've got to have an academic framework for thinking about things, right? At any given point in time, you may be asked a question on, should the government regulate this? If you haven't had a framework for thinking about when should the state intervene versus when not, how are you going to answer that question? You're going to answer that question on the fly. Or you're just going to talk to a few people who are in that field, and I don't think it's going to be rigorous enough. So for me, it's been a beautiful combination where I get the time to do academic work in isolation, and I also get the real world experience so that I don't end up being in the ivory tower, so to speak. I mean, at the cost of sounding immodest, I do think that everybody who steps into the policy space has to be involved in academic ideas. There's no way, if you're not used to reading papers, if you're not used to thinking about them, organizing the information that you know, I don't know how will you do your job at advising a policymaker or drafting a law or implementing a law. So I just don't see them as two separate. I mean, they're a Venn diagram, which you can only do policy if you are enough in academia and if you understand enough of how negotiations happen. It necessarily goes hand in hand.
No, I totally get that. I mean, academic work is meaningless if you don't engage with the real world, and you can't understand the real world without the frameworks in place. But alas, there are too many people whose academic work is completely removed from reality, and equally there are too many practitioners who are not rigorous enough or haven't thought things through. What is this ecosystem like? What is this ecosystem that you're part of like? How small is it? How big is it? How hopeful is it? Is everybody like you? I can also have a selection bias and say, oh, I've worked with Bhargavi and Ajay and I know these people and they are great, it's amazing. Or I can look at other examples and say, man, it's just like so messed up. They just don't care about what they're doing. Give me a sense of this ecosystem of ideas. Is it growing? Is there common purpose? What is it like?
So I think when I got into the policy space, this is mid 2000s, right? So 2014, 15. Actually, lawyers were not in this space at all. It was mostly dominated by the economists, a little of political scientists, and economists view academia as a full-time career option, whereas lawyers don't. The gap between academia pay and legal practitioner pay is way too much for it to make sense to any lawyer. So when I got into this space, actually it was dominated by the economists, but in the last 8-10 years or so, a lot of people from all sorts of fields have gotten into the policy making space. Many of them, I would say, do not value interdisciplinary work enough, and therefore can get stuck in silos. But worse, many of them don't value academia enough. So interdisciplinary the importance of interdisciplinary work is easy enough to explain, right? And I can see people coming around and saying that, yeah, it's just, I have to solve the coordination cost problem. But if I solve that, then yes, there is value in working across different fields and having a team that actually works across different fields.
Everything is everything.
I totally believe that there are just so many connections between history and economics and science and law and political science. It's amazing. But the ecosystem has all kinds of people, and yeah, they don't value academia enough. And that is harder to convince people about, because the perception is that academics work on esoteric ideas which have no application today. It is also true that academics get, pigeonholed into trivial questions because, let's face it, maybe all the hard questions have been answered. Okay. Maybe all the low hanging fruit is already plucked, and now those ideas are already fructified and the end of history has happened, and there is settlement. We all have consensus on capitalism works better than communism on and elevating people out of poverty. And maybe then what is left is essentially these sort of pigeonhole kind of questions which take you down rabbit holes but have no wider application at
So
all.
my sense is that, yeah, that particular hard question has been answered of capitalism versus communism. But otherwise, when I think about law, when I think about rebooting civilization and what it would look like, I think most of the hard questions here haven't been answered, and it is easy to take comfort in answering trivial questions and talk about more judicial appointments, for example, and blah blah blah. And it's easy to take. I think too many people are tempted to take comfort in those kinds of trivial questions rather than actually answer. Go to first principles and look at the harder questions, because, like you pointed out, much of what exists today, the frameworks and whatever, have emerged as a reaction to something. Inflation is bad for growth, let's have independent central banks, and so on and so forth, right? But maybe it's time for scholars like yourself to kind of take that step back and look at the harder questions. Or is that the point you were coming to, that the hard
No, so I'm not explaining why I choose to do academia. I'm saying that the reason why academics are often not considered seriously enough is because they choose to pursue questions which, in their opinion, are optimal for their career.
Yeah.
So whether it is publishing incentives or it is incentives to sound the coolest in the academic peer group. So, for example, currently a very hotly debated question is what is the role of digital currency in the country? Now, to my mind, it's not an important question at all. But it is, digital currency is the hot topic right now, and therefore you'll find legal academics by the hordes writing up on digital currencies. And sure, a state-sponsored digital currency, if that is what fuels your curiosity, go for it. The truth is that their incentives are aligned to write about state-sponsored digital currency, because guess what? It will get them a publication, and therefore that way you end up going into rabbit holes which are not really applicable to the real world. And that in turn makes even bureaucrats and policymakers and decision makers not take, academics seriously, unless just by chance they happen to sort of interact with them and realize, okay, that they're working on a question that actually matters to them. So to answer your question on the ecosystem is actually very new in India. It is not normal for so many people to be working with the government on not implementing their government programs, but conceptualizing the government program. And therefore I would say it's been 2 decades of this ecosystem actually existing with all kinds of different people. And we've got to see what model evolves as most sustainable. Is it the university model, where a center within a university is working with the government on ideas, and then they're conceptualizing the idea, articulating it, and then implementing it? Or is it that independent think tanks which are outside of the university and therefore not bound by university constraints that will actually work with the government? Even if you're not working with the government, just putting out ideas out there that actually will matter in the long run, we have to see what model will work. I've got to say that in the last 6-7 years, maybe all of this is a bit in limbo because only empaneled experts can actually work with the government. So you are anyway restricting the pool of people who will be part of an ecosystem that will be relevant in policy making.
Your knowledge of horticulture and botany don't matter if you're not an empanel gardener. That's the lesson.
That's the lesson.
That's a lesson. So, we did an episode of Everything is Everything called Fixing the Knowledge Society. And our thesis in that was that exactly what you were saying, except I think we expressed it in harsher terms, where I would just say that academics today is completely broken, no connection with the real world, especially in the humanities, some fields more than others, no connection with the real world. Everybody is in silos. People are studying wheat production in the 1700s in eastern Venezuela. Nothing to do that moves the needle anywhere. They follow fashions of the day, which can often lead you down wrong directions, as has happened in development economics, for example, where the focus has moved away from growth. And and the question there was, and like the phrase Ajay and I used at the title of that episode was knowledge society. And I think about that what does a knowledge society look like? Like back in the day, the place which was, the center of the production of knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge, the acquiring of knowledge was a university. And today it is largely broken and irrelevant, and people outside the system recognize it for what it is. And it's a tragedy in two ways. And one way is that many fine minds, once they get into it, just follow those incentives and choose to live within that, and they'll spend their whole lives within that and not move the needle in the real world at all. And that's a tragic loss of talent. But the other also is that there is a lag. There is a lag between something fundamentally changing and then something coming up to take its place. If those institutions are broken, what takes its place? What happens? How does knowledge then get produced and disseminated and acquired and all of that? It can't just happen in this random gardening kind of way that people are doing YouTube courses and people are, whatever. What is that knowledge society? Who are those people? Who are the knowledge producers who are moving the needle forward on the big questions that really matter? So in a broad sense, not accusing you of being part of any of this, but in a broad sense, what is your sense of that?
So one part of me tells me that actually there needn't be one kind of institution that actually prevails over everything. Okay, people can actually organize themselves into a society, or they can organize themselves as part of think tanks that do relevant work. People can organize themselves within a commercial firm and do this kind of work, as a lot of consultancies do. And we have to see over the long run what wins out. It is not obvious to me that only one type of institution will keep winning over time. Okay. It depends which institution is capable of attracting the most talent that will remain relevant in policy making, and that will actually win out. So there was a time when economics as a profession won out when it came to influencing policy. Today, I don't know, okay? Even economists are realizing the importance of being in interdisciplinary teams precisely for the reasons that we mentioned. And of course, right now you have a government-sponsored think tank that is winning out, but it need not always be the case. And I don't think it should be centralized in one type of institution. There will be many. Let 1,000 type of institutions bloom and we'll see which one is most efficient, will last out. I think we'll have a diversified portfolio of different kinds of institutions doing this work. Some will be within universities, some will be outside, some will be within consultancy firms, and maybe each one has its place. I could argue that a consultancy firm is much better place to implement a government program. Whereas and I include policy work to not just include the knowledge society. I think implementation is a very, very critical part of policy. And I think consultancy firms are greatly placed to just roll out implementation at scale. I don't think universities are great at that. Universities are much better at doing esoteric stuff, which at some point, some person makes the connection between that esotericism and reality, and it just comes together. Think tanks are great at, I would argue, even popularizing the idea, socializing ideas. So I don't think there's going to be one type of institution. It will be many types, and they all will have their place and role. And I'm not saying this as a diplomatic answer, although I don't think anybody really minds what I say. But the point is that we shouldn't try to force fit our ideas of today, what is happening today is a function of time. It will not be the case throughout. And maybe different kinds of people will survive in different organizational setups and still do the same kind of work. Who knows?
Couldn't agree more. I mean, let freedom be the default. 1,000 institutions will bloom, as you
Yeah.
put it correctly.
Yeah.
So let's move away from this boring talk of state and economics and law and all, and let's kind of move back to yourself. What is self-actualization for you? Like outside of this law and economics and whatever, who are you? What do you do? What are your interests? What's going on in your inner life?
Oh my God. Okay. Actually, I'm quite the nerd that way. So I'm pretty much reading all day or doing some of the other work. I mean, I guess what happens when you train to be a lawyer is that you spend your early years either in a law firm or in a counsel practice, and that's a very exacting profession in terms of time. You don't end up developing a hobby of sorts at all. So I honestly have nothing much outside of work. I'm sorry if that sounds like a boring answer, but that's the truth. It's basically, I love the team at XKDR. It's an interdisciplinary team where we work with cool data from courts. On any given day, for example, yesterday I was thinking about Sanjeev Sanyal's comment on do court vacations actually increase pendency? And I said that why can't we use our data to figure out the answer to this question? For example, for cases that are filed in and around vacations, can we compare their first hearing date to cases that are not filed in and around vacations, right? So if both types of cases actually get their first hearing within the 3 months, that tells us something about the truth of this proposition, right? So on odd days, I'm thinking of those things. On even days, I'm reading Albert Camus' The Plague or The Stranger or something like that. That will help me keep myself sane. I've recently got into music, and I'm learning to play the keyboard. So I hope to be able to graduate to the piano by next year. So let's see.
Wow. When did you start learning?
About 2 months ago.
Not bad. I mean, economists learning stuff, lawyers learning stuff. Your friend Rajeshwari, who is recording with me tomorrow, in fact, though that episode will release first, is learning the guitar, I think. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, you could all form a band, the XKDR band. Yeah.
We'll name it something else. We'll come up with a cooler name.
You have to come out with a cooler name.
Yeah.
So, before we wind up the show, I really have to ask you to share with my listeners what I believe is the most radical reform suggestion that I have ever heard. And I sort of keep quoting you to people on this, and it's quite delightful. So tell me, you want to get a really difficult reform done. How do you do it? How do you push it through?
Okay, so this takes me back to that dinner conversation. And we were talking about how do we get, this was before the disinvestment of Air India. And the question was that how do we get the government to move on something as hard a decision as disinvestment of Air India? Which officer will be ready to sign such a file? Okay, and it just seemed logical to me that an officer who's on a terminal illness will actually be more than happy to sign such a file, because the consequences to him are actually pretty limited. And I mean, what better way to end your life than actually by leaving the legacy of having signed the file of disinvestment from Air India, right? So I just put it forth as a suggestion, which is that, we find a cadre of officers who are on a terminal illness and make them sign the files with all the difficult decisions, because it seemed like a problem that everybody was discussing ad nauseum, that who will sign, which officer will sign under the threat of the 3 Cs, the Central Vigilance Commission and the CAG and the CBI. And there are so many such hard reforms that have to be done and which are stuck simply because we can't find officers who will sign those files. Just get the guys with the terminal illness.
There's a novel in this, because now it opens up further options. You can get into nuances. That one, do you find the guys with terminal illness? B, do you induce terminal illness in someone so they'll do it? And C, do you make someone falsely believe that they have terminal illness when they don't? So at the end of the day, the 3 Cs come after you and you're like, oh my God, I have another 30 years to live. So, but...
anything for the cause, right?
Anything for the cause. So, a delightful note to end on, as it were. were, but we won't end here. Let me ask you a question that I ask all my guests on the show. That for me and my listeners, recommend books, films, music that you love and which mean a lot to you.
Okay. All right. So let's see. I mostly recommend books that actually inspire people because I feel that one thing that we don't have enough around us is inspiration. So, one book that has really inspired me is Phil Knight's Shoe Dog. I think it's a great book on how he built Nike as an organization, how he scaled it up, how he failed so many times. And despite that, he kept at it. And it was only his passion for the product, for building a shoe that helps people run, right? I think it's a fantastic story. I think to keep sane, you should be reading books that help you develop a stoic attitude. And I find Camus pretty good in helping you calm down, and the world is as it is and it goes on and you are just one cog in a wheel, and so things like that. What else films, and I'm not much of a film watcher. I'm a great Bollywood buff, but I don't know if that really helps.
Whatever you love.
Okay, I'm thinking of the last good movie that I watched. Yeah, Lapata Ladies is great. Everybody should watch it. Everybody in India should watch it. It's about I don't know if you've watched it actually.
Actually, I haven't, but I've been meaning to. I've been
Yeah,
meaning to.
yeah, yeah.
Haven't been avoiding it.
It's I think it's about feminism without really virtue signaling or preaching. And it's feminism in the classic sense, which is a classic liberal sense, which is that how does a woman realize liberty and how within her own constraints she navigates to realize her own agency, and having agency has no one meaning. I mean, within within your circumstances, whatever you can do to realize your free will, I mean, that's exercising agency. And Lapata Ladies just conveys it in a beautiful, humorous fashion. You should watch it.
Can't wait to see her. I did an episode with Mukulika Banerjee where I think it was her. I often get mixed up, so forgive me if it's not her. But I think it was her who mentioned how, I think in the 40s or the 50s, her mom and a female friend set off in a Tonga and went from one town to the other on their own. And I found that beautiful. And when I chat with sort of guests of that vintage, I think Mrinal Pandey also kind of brought it up. You realize that a lot of women whose lives you would be judgmental of today, saying, oh, they were oppressed and all of that.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a lived feminism in their actions, right? Within those constraints, they do what they can.
Yeah.
And
that is exercising agency.
That's
right?
that's agency. That's inspiring by itself.
So a friend of mine actually told me a beautiful example of, because she does a lot of rural field research on, and she met in some village of Rajasthan when women, and this is very common actually in a lot of urban centers, where a woman who's on her menstrual cycle is asked to stay in a separate room, not allowed to enter the kitchen and things like that. And we always think of it as it being oppressive. And when she met these village women and she tried to ask them that why do you think this is scientific, they said they were very happy because that means they get a day off work, of housework. They get a day off having to go to the market and get a day off work having to go and fill water from the nearby municipal tap and things like that. And they said it's great. And that's when she was like, I was so humbled that our definition of agency is not everybody's definition of agency, and people actually exercise their agencies in ways that they find absolutely possible.
Like one episode where I got a lot of such counterintuitive insights was with the great Dalit scholar Chandrabhan Prasad. And Chandrabhan ji was just throwing these insights one after the other, and I'll just share a couple of them. And one is not gender specific. In fact, it's probably male specific. He said that whenever he sees an elder person in his extended family with a paunch, he feels happy. It's a sign of progress. Like if they have diabetes, it's a cause for celebration because he could afford to get diabetes, and I love that story. And the other one, which does have to do with gender, which is why I thought of this, is he points out that there are places like typically our view is that ghungats are bad. It's a sign of patriarchy, women are oppressed, etc., etc. But he said that Dalit women in the village that he comes from, they celebrate that they can get married with a ghungat because a generation ago it would not have been allowed to their caste. So it is a sign of their empowerment that they can now get married with a ghungat. So it just tells you that the world is so complex and layered that you should never come to easy judgments, but actually do the hard work of getting out there and, feeling it for yourself.
Which is why I ask the litigants, what does he want? As opposed to asking the judge, how many assistants do you want?
You are too nerdy for me. This is your widest smile I've seen so far when you're saying, ask the litigants. Okay, fine, I will ask the litigants.
Hence proved.
Hence, yeah. Thanks so much for coming on the show. This was great.
Most welcome, and I had a great time. Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, share it with anyone you think might be interested. Check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. You can follow Bhargavi on Twitter at Bhargavi Zaveri, that's one word, link from the show note also. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and any podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.